Another really important part of modeling in Blender is the modifier system. This is an extremely powerful part of really either deforming or creating new geometry in Blender, and it's going to make your modeling so much faster. The very first one we're going to look into is the subdivision surface modifier. So here we have our nice little monkey, but she is really low poly, so you can't really work with this directly. So the way we're going to be doing this is we are going to be adding more subdivisions to her by using a modifier called subdivision surface modifier. You can access this by going under modifiers, find the modifier panel under the wrench icon, and then add modifiers. And we can go here under subdivision surface. So we have two different kinds of modifiers we're going to be covering now. We have generate, which generates new geometry, and deformation, which just deforms the geometry which is there. This is a modifier which actually adds new geometry, so it will live under generate. So click it here. And now you can see that we have more polys on our model, 4 times more to be exact. Under here, we only have a few options. We have the viewport subdivisions, which is how many times it's going to be subdivided in the viewport, and how many times it's going to be subdivided at render time. This is really useful because it means you can have a really low res cage in the viewport at set to 0, and it can render at something like 5 subdivisions. So it keeps viewport performance really, really low.
This is really great for very heavy scenes. Let's say you're making an entire forest or something. All the trees and rocks need to be subdivided in your scene. Your computer wouldn't necessarily be able to handle that in the viewport, but during render time, that's going to be a lot more manageable.
And if you want to make this even smoother, of course you can just keep adding divisions here, but that gets a bit crazy. So what you can do, you can right click on your object in object mode, then you can hit shade smooth. This is just going to make your normals actually smooth as well. You probably want to use a combination of shade smooth and actual subdivision modifier.
Yeah, you'll be able to see, like, if you set the viewport subdivision back to 0, but still keep the shaded smooth, you can see that it actually doesn't subdivide your object, it just smooths the normal. So finding a good balance here is the trick.
Yeah, I find that often 2 subdivision levels with shade smooth is going to look really good, particularly from a distance like this. This is really one of the modifiers you're going to be using a lot. It is used so often that, as far as I know, it's the only modifier which actually has its own hotkey. If you hit Control 1, it's going to add a subdivision level of 1, Control 2, 3, 4, etc. This is going to add another subdivision level to it. And if you want to disable it, you hit Control 0, and that's going to set it to all the way down to 0. You can delete modifiers by hitting the delete button, or the X here to the right, and that's going to delete it. If it's red like this, that just means that it's not actually doing anything in the viewport like this. So setting to 0, obviously nothing is happening because nothing is, 0 is nothing. So set it to 1 again, and it goes back to being a functional modifier in the viewport. The next one we're going to be looking into is the lattice modifier. So if we want to deform this object, we can of course use a bunch of different tools like the proportional editing, but a really powerful way is to use a lattice modifier. So if we were to select it now, and then go to add modifier, this is going to be a deformation modifier, because it's, like we said, it's just going to be moving points. So now we go under lattice, deform, lattice, and now we are only halfway done. You can see here is red, meaning nothing is actually happening. So the first thing we have to do now is we have to go to Shift A, and then we have to add a lattice object here. So a lattice object is going to be a cube like this. If we were to scale it up so it fits the entire character, scale up a little bit more. Scale it in the Z a little so it fits like this, and now it encompasses the character. We can now use this lattice to deform this monkey. If we go to lattice, the actual modifier, and then we can pick it here, and then just hit lattice. Now it's ready to be deformed. So if we were now to hit the tab key, make sure the actual lattice is selected, hit the tab key, and now you can just select one of the corners, and then we can move it around like so.
Yeah, you could even combine this kind of selection with proportional editing as well. So, you're kind of combining many things to get like a different kind of deformation.
Yeah, that's really where the magic of 3D happens. If you just know one feature, you can do very limited things. But if you know like all the different concepts we're showing you here, you can really do most things you want to. We can also add more resolution to the lattice object by going under select lattice object, then going under the object data for the lattice, and then we can add more segments like this. This is really cool because now we can very quickly drastically change the object. We can just select all of them. We can move it up like this. We can move this down. We can move this here up a little bit. So now you can just see we have a very different character right away.
Yeah, and with more subdivisions, you just get more control. So if you have the standard lattice, which only has 6 points, you make very broad changes to your mesh. And the more you subdivide it, the finer degree of control you get.
So now we have deformed this poor monkey. And it's awesome. You can really, really do cool things with this. So we highly recommend that you spend some time to get to know this. Next one is array. Array allows you to copy an object in with procedural parameters, which simply just means we can move this here as many times as we want to in either direction. So, or rather copy it. So under modifiers, we now go to generate, because again, this is going to add new geometry. Hit generate. Now you can see what happened. We just added a new object here. And we have the count, which is going to say how many times do you want to replicate this object. We can also move the offset. So now we can just move this over, and now it's going to add just a distance spacing between them. If you want to have precision here, we can hold on a shift key, and then it's going to just really give you a lot of precision here. So if you want to add another array here, let's say we want to have like a pathway going down, so we want the columns to go down here as well. We can easily do this by adding another array modifier. You can totally work with multiple arrays. Now you can see that it just took this entire array and just moved it over once. We can go under the second array, and now you see here we have the offset. So now it's set to X, Y, and Z, and we don't want to move it more on the X-axis. That's just you see here, it moves it this way. So if we move here, it moves it on the X-axis. Set this to 0. Now it's just in the same spot. And then we want to move this on the Y-axis. You can see here, X, Y, and Z. And now we created this really cool little like archway going down into like a nice little Roman or Greek house.
That's really one of the, I guess, strengths of deformers. Being able to combine multiple deformers, whether it's subdivisions, lattices, and then arrays, putting them all together just gives you the ability to work incredibly procedurally, which means that you can always go back in your work, make changes. Like if you changed the deformation on one pillar, all those changes would be reflected on all the other pillars. Yeah,
it's really cool. You can change so many different things with it. This is really one of the main strengths now. If we made this weird thing on top of it.
It's almost like candles.
Yeah. And then if we were to just disable this one, we can look at the next one. The screw modifier is a funky one, but it's a really interesting one. So here we have a little piece we've created. This is amazing for creating stuff like glass. This is just a very simple shape we have made just with a single vertex, and we just extruded this out. There's really nothing fancy about this. This is all just geometry made with basic modeling tools. Like here's a vert, and we just move this around, and then we use the bevel tool on it to create some more resolution. So how can we make a glass from this simple shape? Well, we can use the screw modifier. If you go into modifiers, and this again is going to add geometry to it, then we hit screw, and now you can see we get this funky looking shape. The first thing we need to do is hit calc order, and that's going to give us this nice shape like this. You can also see it's set to 360 by default, and what this is really doing is, it's just taking our shape, and then it's just adding more degrees to it like this. And that's why you can get away with just making a simple cross section of it. You can even take it further than 360 and just really create some fancy shapes. Cool thing about this is if we were now change any one point of this, we will now have drastic changes to this entire piece. So if we now hit G and then X, you can now see that it's just moving, it's just changing the entire model like this.
It's kind of like comparable to working with clay on a spinner, where you form clay, you make pottery. It's the same principle with the screw modifier, and especially once you get into editing. Points.
This is just a different way of working. This is a bit more advanced way of working than if you were to just make this out of like a cylinder or something. It has pros and cons to it. Then we are going to be quickly looking into a feature we haven't looked into yet, and that is wireframe. If we go up here to you see this nice little triangle up here, overlays, we now have under geometry wireframe. So now you can actually see the wireframe of the objects in object mode. So we can now change the step size here to create a higher and more low poly object. So if you want this here to be set to, something really low poly for like a mobile game, we can set it to there, or we can just very quickly up-res it to like full-on movie asset like this.
The advantage of this kind of workflow, especially when you're making pottery, glass, or something similar that you want to screw around, is that you interactively can change the resolution of it, which is a little harder if you're doing traditional modeling, like box modeling, or you're extruding something, whereas with this, you can change the resolution on the fly.
You can also change which axis it's going to go on, which is going to look pretty crazy. Clearly this is not going to work. It's going to work. It's just going to give you different results. It's not going to give you the expected result. But, you can use this to get interesting results. Next up, we have the same modifier, but using in a completely different way. Here we have 3 circles, just regular polygonal circles. And we can add the screw modifier to this as well. And you can see what happens. Now everything is in the same spot. But if we were to just set the screw amount and just increase this now, you can now see that we have created a little rope. If we just go up here and we disable wireframe again, you can see what's going on. You can also hit flip to normals. And we can now just set this to a higher or lower number. So if you want this to be a really, really long rope, you can set this to something like this. And then we can change the angle to something more like this. We can really just give you like a nice twisted rope. I really like this approach for modeling, because if you were to do this without deformers, this would be pretty tricky to do. Particularly if you have any changes. Imagine you have a client and he's like, oh, I want this many rotations on a rope. And you were to model this in by hand, that would be very painful. But now you can very quickly just add more resolution to it and completely change the shape of it. Then we have the bevel modifier. So we've already showed you how you can add bevels manually to this. You can select everything, hit Ctrl B, and you can just bevel it. You can also do this with a modifier. Under Add Modifier, we can now add bevel, and this is going to change geometry, so it's going to generate. And it doesn't matter what's selected, it's going to add it globally to everything. So if we now, actually we should again go in and add wireframe to this. You see what's going on. We have a few different options we should change. We have the width, which is going to change how drastic is the beveling going to be. And we have the segments, how round is it going to be. Now we can just set this to something like 4, and now we get this nice rounded look. Now you can see though that it also bevels every single edge here. So now this here becomes very angular, so we don't really want that. We don't want actually everything to be beveled. We want to limit this, and we want to limit this based on the angle between the different polys. We can easily do this if we go to limit method, then we have angle. And now you can see you can change the angle and what it's based on. So now we have a lot less, we don't have these polygons being beveled. So now we have a lot more controlled results. Very easy to change your subdivision or to change your beveling on this. Then we have the surface deform. Let's take away the wireframe. Surface deform is awesome because it allows you to deform one object with another. So we have this image, or we have this model here, which has a bunch of different holes in it. And if you want to move this around or to actually deform it, it might be a bit hard because it's so dense. What we can do is we can take a simple object like this, which just has a few polygons, and we can deform this really high poly object with this low poly object. We do this by going onto the high poly object. Just make sure it's selected. It can be a bit tricky to select the right one sometimes. Then we go under Add Deformer. And since this is a surface deform, it's pretty easy to know that it lives under the Deform tab. Add Deform. And you can see it's now red. This means that nothing is happening here because we still haven't defined what deforms it. So we can now open up this, and we can now set the grid, the low poly one, to be the target. You can also just pick it in the viewport by clicking here and doing it. Then we can hit bind, and now we can easily select these and just move it around. Combine this with proportional editing, hit the G key, hit the O key, and then we can very easily just move this around like so.
This is something that we do for film quite a lot, especially with very heavy characters that we rig or we animate or we simulate. In When we work like this, we often have very low poly objects to deform our high poly objects, because just like with the arrays, when we have a lot in the viewport, we don't actually have very good performance. So oftentimes we'll have a low-res representation of the object itself, and then during render time, it'll actually be showing the high-res object.
Yeah, the cool thing is you can also turn this off as well. You see here you have two options. You have a render, which is show it during the rendering, and we have show it in the viewport. So you can turn this on and off. This is true for nearly all modifiers, where you can have it be displayed only in render, for instance, or you can have it displayed only in the viewport. Be a bit careful when doing this though, because you don't want to end up in a situation where it's accidentally not rendering. Then we have the skin modifier. The skin modifier allows you to select polys or edges like this, or any kind of geometry, and just add a lot of thickness around it. So if we were now to select this object in object mode, we can go under generate, and then we can go to skin. And you can see what's happening now. It simply just adds a lot of polygons around this. We can also select the actual object here, or the actual polys. Select them all. Disable in viewport so you can actually see what you're doing. Then enabling it again. And Control A allows you to now very easily just add thickness to your model. Then we have the mirror modifier. Mirror modifier is amazing when you're doing any kind of organic modeling. For instance, if you're doing a character like this, you might not want to model both sides, because that would be a complete waste of time. Or you could copy it over afterwards, but it's really nice to be able to have this be live and symmetrical whenever you're modeling. So if we go under modifier, and this is going to generate geometry, so go under mirror, and there we go. This now automatically mirrors it over, and it's really handy because now you can just change one side and the other side changes automatically. This also doesn't care if you change topology at all, which is why it's so useful for actual modeling. Then we have the displacement modifier. The displacement modifier allows you to move or to shape the actual object using an image. So if we were now to add a displacement modifier to this would be under generate and under deform and displacement. We know it's under deform because it doesn't add geometry, it just moves points around. So this looks like it just pushed it outwards, and it kind of did, and that's because there isn't an image to control it. We need to actually add a texture map to it, and we do this by hitting the new texture map. And then we can go under the texture map options here to the bottom. And here we can easily add an image, such as clouds. And this is just a procedural map. We're just now moving it around like this. So now you can change settings for the actual procedural you're using, or you can change this directly in the modifier itself.
And this is a very common practice for commercials and film, where we will be sculpting a very high resolution object, and then we have a displacement map that we then apply to a low resolution object, and that way again saving time in the viewport and only applying something at render times.
You can also change the strength of it right here as well.
Yeah, and like cool. The cool thing about this, you can animate things, so you can have animated displacement. There's a lot of different things you can do with this modifier.
Also, if you are using this with other software, maybe like ZBrush, you can change the mid value right here. This is not relevant for most of use cases though. You can also notice here that we have a subdivision surface on the bottom. This is just so we add more geometry to it. If we were to now disable this, you can see how low poly it is. So it's really important that you actually have some resolution to play with, because the only thing the displacement modifier is doing is looking at the texture map, and if it's the pixel is white, it's going to push it outwards. If it's black, it's going to push it inwards. So it can't create new geometry. It's simply going to look at this point. Is the texture map here? Is it white? Then it pushes it out. This is black, then it pushes it in. So it's really important that to make sure that you have a subdivision surface modifier on the bottom. You can see how we get more and less resolution the more subdivisions we add to it. Then we have the wireframe modifier. The wireframe modifier is one of these. It's not one of the modifiers you're going to be using all the time, but once you need it, it's quite handy. If we go to add modifier and then we go to the bottom of generate, because it actually generates topology, now you can see what happens. It looks like this weird 1980s tech demo of a monkey.
Welcome to Tron.
Welcome to Tron.
That's basically it.
We can also disable replace original, and now it adds it to the top of this. Now it becomes this like 1930s film poster. This is really cool because it allows you to present your model with wireframe on top of it. If you want to really make this thick or thin, you can just really just add this on the bottom, on top. We've been using this a few times to present our models because it just means it's a lot easier to see your wireframe. Or we can use something like rebar, where you just create a general piece, then you click add a modifier to it, and you have this nice like rebar feeling to it. You can also enable it here in edit mode, and now you can just move it around, and you can see how the points just follow it around. This is really cool, and I love working with this modifier. Then the very last thing we're going to be looking at is how do you copy one modifier from one object to another. This is really easy. We have an object here which has 2 bevel modifiers to it, and we have an object here which has nothing to it. We can easily do this simply by clicking on the slave object, clicking on the master object. Basically, we want this one onto this, so we click this first and then that. Slave and then master. Then we hit Control L, and now we get an option here to make links between objects. We want to link the modifiers, so now click modifiers, and now we have it here. Keep in mind, this is not a live link. This is a one-way street, so this has now been copied over to it. So if we were to now change this on one of them, they're now completely independent of each other.
The nice thing about this feature when you're linking something aside from modifiers is that it works for most other things in Blender. Actually, you could copy over materials in the same way here. So just be aware, that this menu actually exists, and it's very, very powerful.
So with all the modeling done, it's time to get into the shading of this lightsaber. Now, before we do that, we just have to do a little bit of cleanup in our scene. Now, it would be exceedingly boring to watch me do this, so I'm just going to explain to you what we have done now behind the scenes. If you now were to go into the geometry folder in the scene file, follow along with this chapter, you can see that we have put everything into collections, and we have given them a name which is descriptive. Now, why do you want to do this? Well, imagine if somebody else is going to pick up your scene, or if you pick this up in a few weeks, you have no idea what's going to be going on. Plus, it makes scene organization a lot easier. For instance, we have now put this into collections so that we have all the essentials in one collection here, and then we have all the non-essentials there. So let's say you want to give this to more as a low-res version to a rigger, for instance. You can easily do that, meaning that they're not going to have all the extra stuff which might not be necessary for their modeling or for their performance. It also just makes it a lot easier. We can also look into something we've done here. After every single model, we have _geo. Now, this isn't necessary at all, but it makes it a bit easier. It means, for instance, if you want to quickly search for everything which is a piece of geometry now, we can just go into the search and type geo. And now everything here, which is geo, is going to show up like a firefly. Same thing if we were to search for collection, we have now underscored them all with collections. We can just do this, and now all collections are going to be searchable. This just makes your life a lot easier, and whenever you're doing anything when it comes to these kind of assets, it just makes so much sense to do it. It might take you 20 minutes to do, but you get this paid back with interest over time in the project. So I highly recommend you to do this. Now, again, just a quick reminder how to make collections. That is, you just select the objects you want, hit the M key, make new collection, then you just name it, and it will go into the collections like this. Under scripting as well, we also have a nice little script for you, which is just going to add a geo to the object. So you don't have to add this by hand. So for instance, if we have a new piece here, we have this as a cube, and this is right here, and we now were to just hit run script, you can see it becomes cube_geo. So there's absolutely no reason to do this by hand. So all this just makes our life a lot easier. Okay, so before we start to add the shaders to it, we need a way to move this guy around here. We need to make a teeny tiny rig just so we can just move him around, scale him, rotate him, just so that he's right now, you can see he is in the actual center of the scene, which we don't want. We want to be able to pose this lightsaber around. So what we can do, we can, with just a scene collection selected, we can hit Shift A. Now we can go to empty, and we can add any one of these empties. It really doesn't matter which one we use. We're just going to be sticking with the cube for now. That empty is just a representation, or it's just an empty tool. It's just an empty piece of geometry you can use. You can use this to parent a bunch of stuff to it. So for instance, if you want to move something else based on this, you can easily do that. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing. We're just going to be moving this into center like so. We're just going to be scaling it down a little bit like so. So this doesn't do anything by itself. Like this is not like a lattice object, and it's not like a cylinder or cube or anything. The only thing this is doing here is so that we can use this for different things like moving our object around. So it doesn't even have to be in the center. This really doesn't matter. This is just so we have an idea of where it is. So then we are going to select all the pieces of geometry here. Just right click on the geometry collection. And then we're going to select objects. This is going to select all of them. Then we're going to shift click on the empty. We're going to hit Control P. This is going to parent the objects to the parent. It's basically going to select parent everything to the current selection, which is the last object. So just hit Control P and then hit object. And there we go. And now you can see if we were to rotate the empty around now, everything is going to follow along now. So this is incredibly easy when it comes to wanting to pose something like this. This is a lot easier because instead of starting to move everything around, you have all the transforms you need just on a single object here. You can see here now only a single value here is actually being changed instead of the values on every one of these pieces. Now if you were to move this around, you can see that this would change on this would change on that, so we would have transforms on so many different things. Now we keep them to one. Very, very handy. So now we can just move this up. We can move this like so. And then we're also just going to rotate it around as well, just so it sits better on the ground. This is just going to make the render just a bit nicer. And you can feel free to do whatever you want to here. You really don't have to adhere to anything we're doing here. Anything we're doing right now, that's just a suggestion. Okay, cool. So now we post it. Now if you don't want to see the empty, you can of course just hide it here, or we can go under here, the object type visibility, and then we can click on empty here and you won't be able to see it at all. So whatever you prefer. You can also just reset the 3D cursor to set this Shift S and set this to world origin. Then we can go into our nicely created rendering tab as well, just to set this up. Okay, so we now have our camera set up, and if you are unsure how to do this, you can always just revisit the chapter where we set up the rendering tab. So we are just going to be setting up a quick little backdrop as well for this. We are going to just collapse these, go on the geometry, and then we are going to create a plane. We're going to scale this up. We can hit S and then 10 just to scale it up by 10. And you can see where the camera goes from now. So we can select these two edges. We can hit the E key, right click, and then hit G and Z just to move it up in the Z axis, like so. So we're going to scale this up a lot more. We can S and let's hit scale again, just to scale up by 10. That might be a bit too much. Let's undo that. S and then maybe 5. Maybe that's good. And then we can go in and we can select these three, and then we can just bevel this. You could also do this with a bevel modifier as well. That's really whatever you prefer. Okay, so something like that. Then we're going to apply a subdivision Then we're going to apply a subdivision surface modifier, Control 2 to do that. And then we're going to right click and we're going to do shade smooth. So you can see here now when we were to scale this up further that we get camera clipping. We can fix this if we were to go under the camera. Now you can see how nice and easy it is to find the camera. We can go under here and then we can go to the camera settings. And here we have clip end and clip start. So under this, we can just, under clip end, we just add another 0 to this. If you have this in the viewport, however, then you go under the side menu here, the properties. Then we go to view, and then we can go to clip start and clip end as well. So you can see here, if we set this to like 100, we can have the same issue. And if we just add 2 more zeros to it, now we're not going to have this issue. Really useful if you're dealing with bigger scenes. Okay, so let's just move the camera into place like so. Okay, cool. Oh yeah, we can also see that we have added _ref to our reference as well, which just makes it easy to find all our reference right away. This is a nice little tip. Okay, so now we are going to go into the looked at viewport. You can do this by holding the middle mouse button, dragging over here, clicking on this one, the middle one, or sorry, the right one to the bottom, to almost the right, or hit the Z key, and then we go to looked at. And now we have a looked at setup for this. We can also go in here as well to viewport shading, and now we can change the HDRI. This is just going to change the lighting a fair bit. You want to stick to something neutral. You really don't want to stick with something which has crazy amount of color in it, or too much contrast. We're going to be sticking with this for now, because this is nice and neutral. You can also rotate around if you want to. We are definitely going to be setting up our own lights later on as well, when it comes to actually lighting our scene. This is only for temp, just so we can have something nice to look at. Also, when we do this as well, we need to go into our settings, make sure Eevee is enabled. And we use Eevee for look dev, and then we just make sure the screen-based screen space reflections is enabled, and this just means that we can now see our reflections better. We also have ambient occlusion as well, which can be quite handy to enable as well, particularly in this view. But keep in mind that it is going to cheat your view a little bit. Stuff is going to look a bit more grounded than it actually is. Okay, so with that said, let's add some shaders to it. We can just move the view over here a little bit so we have some more real estate. And now we are going to be adding shaders to this. It's very easy to add shaders, and we are going to be adding a few different ones. So we are going to be adding, we're just going to be creating one in the beginning, and then we're going to be duplicating this over. So we are going to be starting out with this one here. And we go down to the material right here. Then we hit new. And this is going to be a metal. This is going to be a metal bright. So the first thing we do is we rename this. It's really important to rename stuff right away as well. Otherwise, it's going to be a huge mess. You have 20 different materials. There are variations of 5 different metals. It's going to be really hard for you to figure out what's going on. So we can set the base color to something a bit darker than this. And then we set the metalness to 100 or 1. This just means that we have that this is metal. And then the roughness is going to go down a little bit. Though we are going to be controlling the roughness later on with an actual map, which we're going to do in the next chapter. And that's really what you need in order to create metal. It's very easy to create a base metal like this. So then we can drag and drop this onto some of the other pieces, which are going to also be metal bright. We do this on this piece here as well. Make sure you click the right one, and we did. And we do this on the very back one as well. If you don't want to do this, like actually drag it, you can just click here as well, and then we can set this to be metal bright. Like for instance, if it's too hard to actually get into that piece, you can just easily do that. Okay, then we can do this to this as well. Like sometimes if you were to add this to, let's say here, it can be pretty hard to actually hit the model if you were to just drag it. So in that case, we can just go in here and just select it. Okay, and then we're going to assign a metal dark, and that's going to be to like this piece here. It's important to assign different values to them just so they look different. If everything has the same brightness, then everything just looks kind of boring. Even if it's a technically good shader, you really want it to have different values. Well, we can also see here as well, it intersecting just a little bit, so let's just fix that right away. That is because the ground floor is not on the floor. There we go. So we just move the ground floor a little bit, and that has been fixed. Okay, so we select this piece now. And then we make a new material, and we call this metal dark. Setting up shaders in Blender is something I really enjoy. It's so fast, and the response is really, really quick. So we can set this to metal again. It's super easy to make something metal. Same with this guy up here as well. We're also going to make this metal dark. So you can now just see that the lightsaber just coming to life, just one piece at a time. Same for this as well. And for this guy too. Whenever we're doing any kind of work like this, I always look at reference. No matter what it is, I will always look at reference for this kind of stuff. You think you know what something looks like, but you really don't. If you want something to look real, you really, really gotta look at reference. Then we can select the bolts as well, and we can make this metal bolts. And we can make this metal again. And again, the metal slider should always be either on or off, and really nothing in between. Something isn't kind of metal. If you have something like, if you have like iron, that is always metal, and you have skin, that is always non-metal. You can think of this if the material conducts electricity. I know somebody commented once on one video saying that, what about water? Yeah, water is not a metal, even though it conducts electricity. In general, a metal is what you would assume a metal is in real life. And then you have something like rust. Well, rust is not a metal, because that is no longer a metal. Same if you have metallic paint, that is also not metal. And if you have like paint on top of metal, that paint is also not metal. Okay, so we can add this shader to the other ones as well. Just the bolts one. We also added in between the takes as well, we added a little bolt in here as well, and we added some slight rifling in here as well, just to make it a bit more interesting. Okay, so I just want to add a little bit of color to these bolts, just a teeny tiny bit, so we can just add that in the color. You can see now we just get some little slight color in it. I want to just make it a little bit orange, like this, just to add some contrast to it. And we also want to make the roughness to go a bit darker. But again, the roughness we aren't too fussed about the roughness, because we are going to be controlling that with a map, like we just mentioned. Then we have these guys here as well. They're like the control rods. So we're going to be adding a material to this as well. I have no idea what they actually are. I'm just calling them like control rods. What you can also do if you really, really want your scene to be clean, this is what I'll do if I'm actually in production. I'll call them _shader, because then you can also just very easily find your shaders as well. Basically every single thing I'll create, I will do an underscore with and describe it. It just makes your life a lot easier when dealing with a lot of different materials and shaders. Okay, in these guys, we are going to be making like an orange color. Something like this, and we can make it a bit darker as well. What's really cool about Blender is that you can copy paste values from anything to anything, which just means that if you now were to want to copy this color here, for instance, into the subsurface color, we can just hover over it, hit Control C and hit Control V. Now that does nothing because we don't have subsurface here, but it's really useful if you want to copy a color from one thing to another one. You can do the same with values as well, copy and then paste, and now you can just see that we have copied a value. Super, super useful stuff. This stuff is also a metal. And for these guys in here, we're also going to make the metal dark as well. And now you can just see how easy it is to just assign this, because now we name this correctly. It is one of these cases where it might look like it's more work up front, but now it means that we're never going to screw this up. We're never going to accidentally assign the wrong one, because we just know it's there. Okay, and then we just assign the same one to these. What we can do as well, if we want to assign one material to multiple objects, is we can find the object we want to be the master. Then we can click on 1, 2, and 3. We can click on all these, and then we can make this one the active one. Then we can go up here. You see this little triangle, metal specials. Then we click copy material to selected. And now we have successfully assigned this one material to multiple objects. And even though it says copy, it's not actually copied. It's just instanced like across. It just means that there is a live connection between the two. And then we're going to create this like copper-like material up here. We can call this copper. We can just remove what's already there and just call this copper. Make this metal, very much so. And then we can make this into like a nice copper color. And we assign this to both of these. So we can do the same thing now. Select these two and then select this, and then we can do copy material to selection. And when it comes to shading, I'm not too fussed about this being 100% correct in the beginning. I'm more fussed about having assigned shaders to it, and we can always tweak it later on. The colors on these two are not correct. We are going to be tweaking this, but it's just so we have something to work with. And then we have this guy here, and he is going to be like an in-between. So he's going to be like metal mid. So he is very much going to be a metal, and he's not going to be dark, he's not going to be bright, he's going to be something in between like this. Okay, and then we have the crystals in here as well. Now for these guys, we can make them emissive materials, which just means they're going to be illuminating by default, because you know they are fancy crystals. We can also just zoom in here as well, just so we can see a bit better what's going on. This is really cool about Blender, where you can actually just change the look depth like this. You can just zoom into something and you can very quickly see what's actually going on. Okay, so we go in here and then we can add emissive. And when we click new here now, it's going to be creating a principled BSDF shader, which is just the default one. That's what you're going to use for everything. But we can also go in here, we can make an emissive or an emission material, which is just an emissive material. And we drag this onto the other one, and we just call this emissive crystal. The most new age material we can think of. And now here in the color, we can now just set this to something, whatever color we want to. This is going to be an evil lightsaber, so we probably want this to be nice and evil. And now if we were to enable bloom, if we go to our render settings here, we can enable bloom, and we can just see what happens now. If we were to just set the strength up, you can see it's now going to be nice and glowing. Now we're not going to be using bloom for the final thing, because we are not rendering with we're going to be rendering with cycles and not rendering with Eevee, so we won't really have this. But if we want to, we can change this. We can change the radius of the bloom, and we can change like the intensity of it as well. Now this is purely for your own personal enjoyment right now, as this will change later on as well. But at least it's cool. We have this glowing nice little crystal in here. Try to make it a bit more orangey and reddy instead of this pink color. No, that's pretty cool. And now you can see everything else around it just glows up as well. Cool. So let's go in and just refine these materials just a little bit. So for instance, with this one, we want this here to be a more desaturated color. So we can just take the saturation down just a little bit, like so. And then we can change this hue a little bit as well. Instead of going into the color wheel where you don't necessarily have that much precision, you can just go in and you can actually change it with the hue wheel as well. Okay, so yeah, it's almost there. Something like that, it looks pretty good. Now we can just rotate this around just to make sure everything has materials. Cool. So what we can do as well now is we can assign, or we can change the HDRI, just so we can see this material under a few different lighting setups. So we go up here to shading, and then we click the rotation, or we click the HDRI, and I can just see how different this looks. It's important that this looks good in general, and not just like, you don't just make this look awesome for like one single light setup, because then you're going to be in trouble. Like in this case, you know, it might work if you were to light this to a single scenario, and it looks awesome for that. But particularly if you are going to be more production focused, where this model here and these shaders are going to be used for like 100 different shots, they have to work for all of them. And that's really the advantage of working in PBR, is that they are going to be working in the majority of shots. You don't really have to change the materials like crazy all the time. So now if we were to just go into the render view instead, and here's the cycles, you can now see what this looks like when it's actually rendered. Now you can see that this here is illuminating up here, and it looks a bit more real in terms of the shadows. Now keep in mind that there won't be really any reflections because we haven't added lights yet. So that's it for setting up the basic shaders. Alright, so let's take this blocked model one step further. Now we need to add a lot of thickness, and we need to add subdivisions to these different pieces here. So let's get started with that. Let's go from the left side, and let's just keep working our way to the right. So you can see here now that we have a pretty decent piece, but it's not going to work that well the moment we add subdivision surfaces to it. Like we talked about it in the modifier chapter, subdivision surfaces is really one of the essential modifiers you are going to be using. If we were now to just make sure you click it, then we hit Control 1 or 2, Control 2 in this case, and now you can see what happens when we add the subdivision surface modifier to it. If we were to just disable it here in the viewport, right now you can see that we lose all this nice beveling which is going on. Let's enable that again. A nice little tip for the subdivision surface modifier is if we disable apply in edit mode, now if we were to just hit the tab key to toggle between edit and object mode, you can now see that it's enabled in object mode and it's disabled in edit mode. So how do we fix this? How do we make sure that this is nice and sharp? The best example we can use here is this edge here. You can see how this edge just becomes completely smooth. So the way we do this is we need to add more edges along here. We need to add one edge here and one edge there. This is very easy to do. We can hit Control R to add a supporting edge. We can add a supporting edge here as well. Now, if we were to try it again, you can now see this line is now really nice and sharp. So we are going to be doing this throughout on this entire model. So let's just start again to the left, and we can work our way to the right. For this piece here, we want to convert this here into quads. Right now, this is what we call an n-gon, which means that it's a polygon which has more than 4 verts. That is problematic when it comes to modeling. Under the hood, every single polygon you see here, this is actually a triangle. So if it is a polygon or a triangle, it will triangulate it under the hood anyway, which means this here would also be a triangle. So now under the hood, it has to just do a lot of operations for it. So we should really help it along. We can do this by either converting into quads or converting triangles. In this case, we are going to convert it to quads. We can easily do this if we first just do a little inset here, just to make it nice. Give it a nice sharp line, hit the I key and just drag. Then we can delete it, hit the X key, and then hit delete faces. Now you can see here we have this open hole. If we hit the space bar now, then we can type grid fill. You see we have grid fill. Grid fill is awesome And if we were now to just change the offset a little bit, now you can see we're just rotating this around, and we now have really nice and even topology. We can also just add a loop here as well. So now you can see this piece here should also be really nice and sharp. So let's just keep adding these. You could also add a bevel to it as well if you select this edge loop, alt-clicking on it, and you can hit Control B. But you can see what happens now is that even when we have more segments, it still rounds it off a little bit. So I prefer to really keep these sharp and instead adding edges on the side like this. You also want to be a little bit careful whenever you're doing this that you don't it doesn't turn too sharp. You want to have a little bit of softness, just because things in real life really isn't that sharp. Even if it's like made in a metallic revolving machine or whatever it might be, you still want to have a teeny tiny bit of fall off to it. Even in this case here, it might even be too hard. So what we can do, we can select it. Just hit W to get into select tool. Alt click on it. And now we can double click the G key. And now you can see we go in here. So double click G and then we go. And then we can just soften this up a little bit. So now you can see it's just a little bit softer. Do the same thing here as well. We can just hit Control R, add a loop here, add a loop here. You can see there's a slight problem though. If we were to go into local view, you can see here that it just cuts off here. So what we can do, we can click the edge, select the edge with the Alt key, extrude inwards, hit the E key, right mouse button, hit the G key, and then we just move it in like so. Now we can add a loop here, we can add a loop here. Now you can see we have nice subdividable geometry. You can still see here that there are like these little facets. You can see here that it's not perfectly smooth. So what you want to be tempted to do is to just keep increasing your subdivisions, but that's going to kill your computer eventually. So what you can do is simply right click and shade smooth, and there we go. Our normals are now nice and smooth. Cool. Go out of local view. And if you're curious about the local view, that's something we do cover in the changing the default one. We set this to the backslash, which is right above the Windows key. So we can do the same thing here as well. We can select the edge loops here, select it, hit the E key to extrude it, right mouse button, and we can just scale it down a little bit. Another way of adding sharpness, instead of adding one here and adding one here, is that we can add one in the center like this, right click, and then hit Control B to really just add the sharpness symmetrically, like we showed you in one of the other videos. So hit Control 2 to add the subdivision to it. And let's go out and let's see. We might also, in this case, want to just select these two loops, Control, Alt click it, and then Control or Shift Alt click it. Cool, so now we can move on to the next piece, which is this piece. Very simple piece. We can try to just add a subdivision modifier to it. Then we go into edit mode, then we hit the S key, and then we just hit middle mouse button and we scale it out like so. You can just see in the left view now what's going on, that we're just scaling it just in a little bit like so. We just want to have a little bit of overlap like this. Then we don't really have to add thickness to it. And same with this as well. Another way to add a thickness to it, instead of going in here and scaling this in, we can, or extruding in the edges, we can select these parts. Hit the X key and delete faces. Now we can select all of them, hit the Alt E key and extrude along normals, and now we can just push it in like so. This gives us an opportunity to show you a very important feature, which is the flip normals feature. And if we select, you can see here now that these are now flipped the other side. So that's massively problematic, and you're going to have tons of rendering issues with this. So what we can do is hit the A key, select it all. Now we can type flip normals. And there we go. Now we have flipped our normals, which is incredibly useful, and you're going to be doing this quite a lot. You wouldn't see this issue though. If we were to now go in here and disable blackface culling, you wouldn't see this issue. Issue is still there. Now enable backface culling, And you can see the issue. This is such a big deal that you just have to have backface culling enabled. Say, click it, and then we can just do flip normals. Okay, so let's add thickness to this guy here as well. We can easily do this. We select a piece. We go into local view. Again, it's not necessary to go into local view. I just prefer it because I can see I have a more honest view of what's going on. Select everything, hit the A key, hit Alt and E, and now we can go extrude along normals. And there we go. Now we can just extrude a bit inwards. And again, we now have the flip normals issue. If you haven't enabled this, you really, really, really need to enable this. Spacebar, flip normals, and there we go. So let's add subdivision levels to this as well. So if we were to now do this, you can see that this looks a bit funky right away. Control 2 to add a subdivision level set to level 2. So we have to just add sharpness to these areas. You can see here, this really gives us this like crazy surface here. So we have to fix that. Before we do that, let's fix the surfaces here. A quick note as well is you never, ever, ever, ever want to model with subdivision surfaces active. By that I mean, you don't do this and now you hit extrude and then you get this up here. This is going to cause all sorts of issues. If you model like this, that is going to give you massive headache because now you're going to be modeling like this and you're going to be rotating around like so and you're going to be doing this and it looks fine. And then you go into modeling view again and it all looks crazy. So for the love of everything that's holy, never ever ever model with subdivision surfaces active. So I really prefer to work like this, where if you hit the tab key, you go in and out of subdivision surface view. So what we can do now is we can do the same little trick we did before. Hit Control R to add a loop here at the edge. Hit right click to disable it. Then we hit Control B, and now we can just really add some edges here, some supporting edges. Do this here as well. Add a supporting edge here, and we can do that inside as well. So now this should be really nice and sharp. We can right click on it and then do shade smooth. And we can do the same thing on this side as well. So this becomes very quick once you get used to it. We still have these guys though, which are really sharp. So how can we fix that? Let's add one in the center and then do the same thing here as well. We want to make sure that this is done. We add the loop here and not here. The reason is, check out what happens now. Now if you do this, you see this nice little crease. This is really nasty. So we need to make sure the loop is added here. We can also add a loop here as well, like here. This is going to sharpen nicely up like this. Maybe this is a bit too close, so let's just hit G key twice. Then we'll go here. We do the same here, just move it in here, and then we can add another one here. So now we have a pretty nice and sharp object like this. What we have to do is, we still need the loops on the inside. So add another loop here, Control R. Then we do Control B and we move it up like so. And now you can see we have a really nice and ready piece for us to use. Another little trick as well, this is more like a general trick, where we have two ways of showing our normals. We have shade, flat, and then we have shade, smooth as well. A lot of times you want something in between. If we were to disable these two now, so you don't want it to be flat, because that looks really bad. But we don't want it to be smooth either, because that makes everything here nice, nasty and smooth. So we want some things to be flat and some things to be smooth. We can easily do this. If we were to go under our object data, now we see we have normals here. If we make sure everything is set to smooth, we now enable auto smooth. So you can see here now that the sharp edges become sharp and the smooth edges become smooth. So this just makes our object look nicer. We can also set this to a different angle. I find that the default of 30 is a bit too soft, so I set this to 45 degrees. It just makes it a bit nicer. This is an optional step, but it just gives you more control when it comes to the smoothing. Okay, cool. So that's this piece done. And now we can focus on this piece. This piece here is a bit harder. And the reason is because you can see in the reference that it has a curve like this, and it has a curve here as well. It also has a hole right here as well. So before we start to add any thickness or anything, we just need to work these things up a little bit. So let's go into the selection box by hitting the W key. If you hit W, we just toggle between them. I really prefer the selection one. Go into point mode, into vertex mode up here. And now we're just going to be moving this over like so. The G key, and then we just snap it like so. Then we hit these two again, and we hit the G key, and we just move it over like this. So this is actually a really common issue. You see what's going on here. For some reason, these have been split off, and it's causing us issues. So the way we can fix this issue, if you have an issue like this is something you're going to encounter all the time. If you find you have issues where stuff has been split off, then you can select everything, hit the Alt-M key, and then merge by distance. Now you can see here it removed 3 verts. Now if we were to move this up again now, everything should be fine. This happens when you hit accidentally the V key. So you can see here now we have a vert, and then you hit the V key. It's very easy to do because it's so close to the B key, and you use B for bevel a lot. Or for selection, all sorts of stuff. So just be aware of this. So we just undo all this, and then the transformation is there. Alt-M by distance, and merge 3 merge verts. Okay, so let's do this again. Select these two, and then we just move it in like so. So when it comes to 3D modeling, you're never gonna do it perfectly the first time. You're gonna make tons of mistakes, and it's not about not making the mistakes. It's more about how can you fix them once they happen. If your philosophy is I'm never gonna have split verts like this, or I'm never gonna have flip normals or anything, you're just gonna be in for a very rough time. It's way more important that you figure out how do you fix it once it happens. Okay, cool. So if we were to now enable a subdivision modifier for this now, you can see what happens. So we want this area here to be really nice and soft, and we can control this. If we were to just add a single loop here, now you can see that we can just control the sharpness of the softness. So we do the same thing here as well. And we do the same thing here. And this looks pretty good, but let's just add a little bit of sharpness here as well. And let's just double check the other side to make sure it looks good. Okay, cool. Now we have a little hole as well we have to get through. So around here, we need to insert a hole. You can see this where this is on a reference. So the way we do this is we need to use an add-on called Loop Tools. We have enabled this. We can enable loop tools very easily if we go to Preferences, Add-ons, and then we just search for Loop Tools. And here you can see we have this enabled right here. And now we should see them, Loop Tools, being under Edit, and here you can see Loop Tools. Now the feature we're going to be using here is Circle. Let's just disable the subdivision surface modifier. So let's just add a loop in the middle of this hole, like so, pretty much in the center. Now we just have to figure where it's supposed to be. So it's supposed to be here. So we just have to make sure we have some supporting edges around it. We are going to add a loop here. We're going to add, actually let's add a loop in the center. Let's add a loop like this with the center one enabled. So this allows us to really have equal distance from the hole. So we want to make a hole around here. So what we can do now is we can hit Control B to make a bevel. You can see that nothing happens. But if you look all the way in the bottom, it says vertex off. Hit the V key, and now we can just very easily just select, or very easily just bevel a single vert. Hit the V key again to toggle between these two. That's V for vert. So we can see that right now it doesn't really look anything like a hole, but what we can do is we can split or join these two together. So J for join, and now you can see that we have this nice quadrant view. It still doesn't look like a circle, but we have a little secret. We have a little circle tool up here, which is found in Loop Tools. If we select the center one, we can now quickly grow our selection like this. And now we've selected all the polygons. This is better. Instead of having to click all these, we can now just select one and move it up. And now we can select circle. And now you can see we have a nice little circle. You can also change the method to fit inside or best fit. You can also change the radius to a specific thing. And we can change it to some settings here. Now we are going to be sticking with default settings for it. These are pretty decent. And then we're going to delete these faces. And just to double check that we don't have doubles, we don't have double faces or any verts going crazy, we're just going to select by distance and just to double check it. Let's just disable the modifier altogether. And you can see it's not perfect, but we can live with this. This is still pretty good. So what we can do is we can simply just shape it up a little bit better. You can see here we just have to move these 2 points out just a little bit so it fits. We just move this out like so. That fits the curvature a bit better. And then we can also add a little loop around it as well. What you often find as well when it comes to doing operations on your model is that sometimes stuff like beveling doesn't look entirely right. Like if you hit bevel, maybe it takes a long time for this to actually appear, or maybe it just doesn't look the way it's supposed to. The reason could be because you have a lot of scaling on your model. So there might be my model might have been scaled up a lot up and down. So we can fix this if we hit Control A, and then we can hit apply, and this applies all transforms. This will just freeze any transform we might have. So you can see here, like it's still not a perfect hole, but if we now were to try it again now with the circle tool, you can see now it gets even better. Now we can add a loop around it like so, and we can see maybe we can add a little circle around this as well. So this just gives us an even nicer circle. So let's see what this looks like with modifier enabled. And we set the context or the option to smooth. So that looks pretty good. So now we are ready to add some thickness to this. So we select everything. We hit Alt E. And we do extrude faces along normals. And we just move it in as well like this. And again, select everything, right spacebar and flip normals. And there we go. And then we add Control R to add a loop in the center. Right mouse button, and then Control B to add the loop here to make it nice and sharp. And just make sure we have 2 viewport subdivision levels. And we have to do the same thing here as well. Control R, Control right mouse button, and then Control B, and then we just move this, just bevel this up like so. Cool. We also have to do this for the hole as well. So this is a pretty common way of adding holes into things. You can also use booleans like we showed you in the booleans chapter. But if you use booleans, please make sure that your topology is clean. This is really clean topology. You can see here everything just works. If you were to do this without clean topology, that would be very, very messy, and you would have to spend days cleaning this up. So now this piece is done. Let's look into this piece. So this piece here is going to be quite interesting to do. We are going to add some thickness to it. Just the same thing we've done before. Alt E, extrude along normals, and then move it in like so. And then we can select everything and just flip normals like so. What's interesting about this is we can add a lot of cool ridges on the inside. So we can add a loop like this on the inside. We can select a loop. We can select a loop like this, alt clicking on it. Then we can do extrude along normals again and just push it in. You can see when I already have thickness, there is no need to actually add additional, to flip the normals again. Do the same thing here. We can do inset. Then we can do extrude along normals. And now you can see we're kind of building up this really cool pattern. We're building up like something more stepped. Maybe this is where the lightsaber gets focused or something. I don't know much about lightsabers, so we will get hate mail for this for sure. So like with everything, we now have to add supporting edges. Very quick to do. We should be in the routine of doing this now. So Control R, select a loop, right click to put it in the center, Control B to add supporting edges. Same thing here as well. So just while we're doing this, we can just discuss, we don't have to talk about every single thing we're doing now, but what we can do, we can start to discuss other ways of doing this. Some people are talking about using something like creasing for this kind of stuff. So if you've heard about creasing, this is something which is being used. It basically means that you can add just a value to it. You can just set a weight to the edge instead of actually adding a bevel to it. That has a lot of value, but it's also quite messy. If you want to bring this into other software, or if you just want to control the model, it's just a lot easier if we are dealing with actual polygons. Because now we're not dealing with anything fancy. This is just straight up polygons, and this is going to work in all cases, no exceptions. Here as well, we just do the inside. So you can see how fast this is once you actually just get into the routine of it. And this might take a little bit of time, but you know, you will get faster. I can absolutely guarantee it. And then we do Control 2 to add a modifier. Right click and smooth. So you can see though, right, when it comes to 3D modeling, that a lot of it really is just the same thing over and over and over again. Which is awesome, because that means there is an actual technique to it. It means you aren't just going to be trying out 100 different things and just screaming into the void all the time. This is going to make sense to you. Just notice this little bevel thing as well here, we just have to enable. So we can easily do this. We can just add a little loop here. We can add some thickness here. We can scale, extrude along normals, like so. And now we're not too fussed about following the reference. Now it's more, that was just about getting us to a good point quickly. Now it's more about what actually looks cool. You can also scale this up just a little bit, just to fill the gap here. Like so. Okay, so we're getting to a pretty good spot now with this. Let's just make sure that all our pieces are in a good shape. We have missed this piece here. So add a loop in the center to it. And then we add loops here. Cool, so now we have a really nice and detailed cube here, or detailed cylinder. Right click, shade smooth. Remember that if you can't find this menu, that's because you are now currently in edit mode. The menu of edit mode, or the menus here are different. They're context sensitive. So if you're in edit mode like we are now, then you're going to see one menu. And if you're in object mode, you're going to see one menu. Okay, cool. Let's add smooth to these as well. One thing you can do as well, which is quite cool, we haven't done this yet, but if you go under the subdivision surface modifier, we have optimal display. So if you see what happens when we enable this, it just makes the display a lot easier to actually look at. Instead of having these incredibly dense wireframes, we can look at something which is a lot simpler. So retopology is a really big part of character sculpting. So when you're sculpting characters, or it could really be anything, it could be CAD software data, it could be really heavy models, it could be from scans, but particularly when you're dealing with characters, you're going to have these really dense characters like this. This can be sculpted in software like ZBrush or in Blender. This character here specifically is sculpted in ZBrush, but that doesn't really matter. What matters is that you have an incredibly high-res model, which you can't really use for much. Now, if you're just navigating around the viewport, you can see that performance is perfectly fine. There isn't any problem here. The problem comes when we start to try to deform this object. So if we now were to go into object mode or into edit mode here, you can see like it has an insane amount of points.
Yeah, it's pretty dense.
It's pretty damn dense. It has 150,000 polys, which is far too much for a general rig to handle. So if you were to give this to an animator, or if you just try to pose this character, it would be really painful. So let's try to just quickly just move some of these points around, and you can just see how slow performance is. This is on a pretty beefy system. If you're sitting on a low-tier laptop, you aren't even going to be able to select this, or maybe even not move around in the viewport.
No.
Now if you look at the low-res model, and we do this, you can see performance is instant. You can deform this guy in a million different ways, and you're not going to have any drop in performance whatsoever. So if you were to give this model here, which has been rigged to an animator, they can animate it perfectly well, and you can pose it up, and you can have a bunch of these in the scene. So what you do is you will make this version from this. You would basically remodel the entire thing, and then you will in rendering, then you will make this version here appear, like either through a normal map or a displacement map. So you get the best of both worlds. You get the high-res details from this model, and you get the performance of this model here. And that's essentially it, why you retopologize. There have been a lot of questions as to why you do it. Now let's look into how you can actually retopologize in Blender.
Yeah, so retopologizing in Blender it's a little bit of setup, and like we haven't really seen this kind of workflow be done before, so that's why we thought we'd try to bring some of that like retopology that you've seen in other software, or how you would do it out in the industry, to into Blender.
Yeah, so these techniques here should work for whatever it is you're modeling. If it's for film or games, or if you're just sitting in your bedroom at home and want to do something,
yeah,
this is going to work for anything there. We are not using any add-ons for this, which are external, and we're going to be using default tools, and this is going to work really well. Before we get started, we need to enable one add-on, which is called the F2 add-on. The F2 add-on is, if you don't know it, you should just use it for everything when it comes to modeling. It is honestly one of my favorite features of Blender, and it's amazing. We'll look more into that, why it's so awesome later on. Now, when it comes to retopology, we have, now obviously we have our low-res mesh already made. We're going to be recreating just a little part of this now. We might do the whole thing later on. But what we need to do is we need to have our high-res model, and we need to then make a single polygon and just populate this here with this single polygon. We're just going to start to extrude it and move it around and all that. Before we do that, we are going to make this guy unselectable, because right now you're going to select him by accident all the time. The way we do this is if we go up here to the very right, we can see we have some filters and restriction toggles. So if we select the selectable one, then you can see we now have selectability as an option. So if we now click on the selectability for the high poly, now we can no longer select it. This is really important, just because otherwise you are going to move it around and you're going to be in a world of pain. So what we're going to be doing now is we are going to create just a single plane from nothing, just a single polygonal plane.
Yeah, it's because once you start retopologizing, you have to have points that you can extract, other points from, and the plane is just the most basic piece of geometry that we can just throw into the scene.
Yeah, exactly. So let's just scale this guy up. A bit too big, and then we can move him up. And then we can start to rotate him around as well. So just so we have an approximate placement where we want to put him. We're going to just be doing a tiny area around the mouth, just so we have some topology to actually play with. So there are some setups we have to do now. The very first thing we're going to do is we've got to enable snapping. Just to show you how this can work, we go into edit mode, and then we enable snapping up here. The hotkey for this is Shift and Tab. And then we go into the snap options. We're going to enable face, which is just going to mean it's going to snap to the polygon. And then we're going to enable project individual elements as well. So now if you were to use the select tool, just hit W a few times to do that. Just to toggle between the selection modes. Now you can see that it's actually snapping to the surface. So this is a really powerful way of working, because now it just means you can now work with new topology on top of this old super heavy base.
Yeah, you don't have to manually sit there and try to match the surface with your plane.
Very painful. That's why we would do it before we really did retopology and sculpting.
Yeah.
We would just model this kind of stuff from kind of imagination, maybe some front and side views, and it was awful. So you can see that there's a problem, and that is that we actually can't see what we're doing. So there are a few things we've got to change here. The very first thing is we need to go into the object context, and then we need to go into viewport display and enable in front. And now you can actually see what's going on. Another thing we need to do is we need to go under our viewport shading, and we need to, under options, enable backface culling. This is just so that you can't see what's on the other side of it. Otherwise, there is just way too much information if you can see the back side of it. Then next up, we are going to create a material for this guy. So we just go under the materials tab, hit a new material, and we can't change the materials here and expect that to change, because these are only going to be appear in the rendering or when we render. So what we need to do, we need to go all the way to the bottom and have viewport display and just give this a color. Now this is technically not needed. This is just so you can actually see what you're doing a lot better. I tend to give it like a fairly desaturated color, but still a color nevertheless.
It's just so it helps you separate it from whatever you're retopologizing on top of.
Yeah.
As well as when you start having a more complex model, you can turn off the outline for the object so it doesn't interfere with the actual high-res object as well.
Then we are going to enable a few modifiers. Modifiers is one of my favorite things about Blender for modeling, and it's such a powerful system. If we go to hit the wrench key, or the wrench icon, we can go to modifiers, and now there are a few ones we're going to enable. The very first one is we got to enable shrink wrap. Shrink wrap just means that you can now snap things to the surface. It's a very simple modifier, but it does exactly what we need it to. It's kind of like if you had like some cellophane and you just wrap that around your face or your arm. That's basically what it's doing. Now if we hit the little eyedropper tool, we can select target and maybe make it selectable again first. That would help. And now we go, and then this unselected again. So now it's going to shrink wrap to it. So if we were to move it around now, you wouldn't really see a whole lot of difference, but it means you just have slightly more accuracy. We also need to just make sure that the cage is viewable in the viewport. Otherwise, you're going to have discrepancies between the actual mesh and what you're seeing in the viewport, and you want this to be exactly the same.
Yeah, so you might be wondering why you both need a shrink wrapper and you have the snapping turned on. It's just for improved accuracy, really. So this way, when you're using the snapping, when you're using shrink wrap, it just ensures that it shrink wraps to your selected object and it doesn't like fly anywhere else. So it's just like using snapping in conjunction with the shrink wrapper just gives you sort of like the best of both worlds.
Then once we have our shrink wrap enabled, now we need to set up the mirror modifier. The mirror modifier is awesome, and it means that you don't really have to duplicate your mesh around. In other software, you might have to do that, but in Blender, you don't have to, which is really nice. So by default, it's just going to mirror. And you can just see the changes in real time, which is really nice. There's one setting we just have to enable, and that is clipping. And that means that if we were to drag this to the center line now, it's not going to go through it. If clipping is off, you can just see it goes crazy. You might want clipping on or off for a bunch of different reasons in general, but when you're doing retopo, you really want it to be enabled. Then, if you have issues actually seeing what's going on here, sometimes you do that where it intersects a bit too much and you get this, we're not really seeing it now, but sometimes you do, you get this like really like flickering result. Then you can go add a modifier and add a displacement modifier. The displacement modifier is just going to push it out of the surface. So it's just going to like move it out for whatever point it is and just straight up move it on its normal, which is really handy if you do have some light issues. If that happens, just set like a really low value, like 0.02, 0.03, something like that. We're not going to be using it for now, but it is nice to know that if you do have display issues, that you can actually do it with that.
Yeah, and those display issues are just that. There's nothing wrong with the mesh or anything. It's just a little annoying to look at. Yeah,
it is. I'm sure Blender is going to get an actual retopo view in the future, which is going to make a lot of this a lot easier. But for now, we don't really have that. This is one thing I've seen a fair few times in Blender tutorials when it comes to modeling, and that is using the subdivision surface modifier when you are modeling. Now, this is something you never want to have enabled when you're modeling. And the reason is, now when you start to drag it out, you can see that there's a huge discrepancy between the cage and the actual generated topology. So it just creates really messy topology, and it's very hard to predict what is actually going to look like.
You can use the subdivision modifier as a way to do sanity checks, but you should never actually do your modeling with it. You know, when you're done, you can tab in and out of your modeling view to view what it looks like with the subdivision surface on, but using it while you're modeling in a smooth view is something you should never actually do.
Yeah, this is what I've seen a lot of people do. They model like this and it looks really nice, but it's terrible. Yeah. You really don't want this. You want your mesh to look as honest as it can. You don't want to have anything which looks fancy or whatever. You want it to look exactly the way it actually is, because otherwise you will cause issues down the line where it doesn't actually align properly.
Yeah, and just from a pure modeling perspective, the final mesh that you have, especially in a production, you should be able to display and have all the details that you need to have displayed without a subdivision surface modifier on it. It just needs to hold the shape. The problem with the subdivision surface is that it can give you a false view of what your mesh actually looks like. Maybe it occupies space in 3D that it shouldn't actually occupy.
This is something we're hopefully going to see from us when it comes to future tutorials, that we're going to be really showing like how we model in production, really like these legit techniques. And this is one of them. Keep it all raw polygons, nothing fancy. So now we have some actual geometry here, and let's look into the tools we're using. The tools we are going to be modeling with are actually really simple. Some software have like a dedicated retopper tools. In Blender, we don't really have that. There are some add-ons, but again, we aren't using that. So the tools we're going to be sticking mostly to is really going to be extrude, merge verts, and just moving points around. So it's very simple to do this. Now we can hit the 2 key just so we can switch to edges. And this is the way I prefer to lay down my topology. I control the right mouse button, and now you can see it just lays out these awesome loops right away.
Yeah, it's a really quickly and efficient way to get like strips of polygons laid out.
Very, very nice. So you just saw me there using the G key as well, just moving stuff around with the G key as well. You can also use the G key to slide your points or your polys around. If you double tap G, now it's just going to be sliding on the surface. This is something you are going to be using all the time when modeling. As a tip as well, when it comes to laying down your loops, is you want them to be as clean as humanly possible. The messier your topology is at this stage, the messier it's going to be. Like here, I just want this to be spaced a bit more evenly and just to look a little bit nicer.
Yeah, even spacing is really the key to topology. Nice topology, especially when you want to take it into sculpting or you want to reproject details later on. The more even your spacing is, the more consistent your detail level is going to be as well.
Yeah, exactly. Very important for that. When it comes to moving the points around, I'm simply just using the select tool. Just left mouse button dragging on it. Very nice and easy. Then a tool we're going to be using a lot as well is the add edge loops tool. And we can do that by selecting an edge and then just hitting Control R. This is very nice and easy. So now we just drag down an edge loop, and then we can add more resolution here. And then we can just continue to refine this. You're going to be using this tool a lot. If you want more resolution around here, you can just drag or Control R and just start dragging. Hit the right mouse button if you want to be in the exact center of it. But you don't want to go this dense this early on. No. This is just to show what the tool can actually do.
Yeah, the whole the key principle behind retopology is that right in the beginning you just want to block out your loops, and you want to have as few loops to support your details as possible, and then you can start to go in and add more detail as needed.
That's probably the number one issue I see with retopology, is that people go way too dense way too early. So we're gonna have a separate video on how to do really nice topology. But for now, we're just going to be showing you the tools. This is going to be a way more technical demo. Then one tool we are going to be using a lot as well is just the extrude tool. That's, basic modeling. Hit the E key and just drag it out. We can also just scale it down as well. Hold down the middle mouse button, and then we can just scale down a little bit. S the middle mouse button. I really prefer to keep this straight from an early time. If they're like this, and now you were to add a loop in the middle, you see this is now it now has the curve baked into it, and you really don't want that. You want this to really be flowing as nicely as you can. So extrude is a tool you're going to be using over and over and over again. It really is the same tool as we used before, for laying down points, control right mouse button, but it's you just have a bit more control with this. So then you again hit the E key, and then you can just start to scale it. You can rotate with R key and move it around with the G key. Very, very useful stuff. Then we have a tool which is, we just briefly mentioned before, which is absolutely magical. That is the F2 add-on. Now the F2 add-on I'm using specifically for one thing, and that is if you want to add a poly which is here. The way you could do it, of course, you could extrude it up and you can merge it, or you can select this point and hit the F key.
So it's important to note that this will only work if you have 4 edges connected to a vertice.
Yes.
Or vertex. Otherwise, it just it doesn't add it correctly. But it's a really quick way. Yeah.
Like if you do that, it's not going to work.
But it's a really quick way to just block in a lot of polys really quickly.
Yeah, this is one of the tools I'm using the most when I'm actually retopoing in Blender. Like when it comes to retopo, it's not about 100 different tools. It's about having a few tools which works really well, and you just know them in and out. So F2 and extrude is really used a lot.
Yeah, and I think one of the main issues with retopology, or traditionally retopology in Blender, is that you have access to so many add-ons that can do so many different things, but it's very easy to lose sight of why you're actually doing retopology, and you focus too much on the tools and what these fancy tools can do, instead of getting the basic knowledge of retopology down first, and then you can start branching out and adding a lot of add-ons afterwards.
Yeah, it really isn't about finding the best add-on. It really is about knowing the principles of this. Like when we've been mostly retopologizing in Maya, and going into Blender isn't that hard, just because the tools are the same. So once you understand the theory of it, it's not very hard to switch to different add-ons or different tools, whatever you might use. Then we also have a nice little thing, which is hitting Alt-Z. This just enables X-ray. You can also do it up here. This is really nice sometimes if you actually need to see the underlying surface. For instance, if you want to align this here to the nasolabial fold, it's really hard to do this if you don't have X-ray enabled, because then you don't really see exactly where it is.
Yeah.
So I use this a fair bit as well.
What you could do as well, if it's a more permanent thing you want to do, you could add some transparency to your shader in the viewport, for example. So it just has a little bit of transparency, so you could always look through it.
Then we have a tool which is really useful as well. This is just allows you to merge the verts, or merge anything really. So let's say we have an edge like so, and we just delete this. We want to merge this and this for some reason. Now, the way we do this is just hitting the Alt-M key, and then we just do to center, and this just merges this. The Alt-M key is really annoying because you gotta move your hand so much, and with time that's gonna contribute to carpal tunnel syndrome and all these kind of things. But just this short term, it's just really annoying.
Yeah, the fact that you have to take both your hands off in order to do it.
Exactly. So I recommend remapping that to something else. We are sticking to default here because it would be a rubbish tutorial if not.
You don't want to start the tutorial with first you have to remap these 20 items.
No, that would be pretty rubbish. Then we have a tool which is really useful. This is the bridge tool. This is a tool you're going to be using a lot. So if we have a hole here, and you want to connect these two, now you hit the F key, and it's just going to bridge these two tools. Extremely useful. Now the F2 add-on also allows you to do this as well. Instead of selecting these two, you can select only one of them. So select this one and hit the F key. This will be if something isn't merged. You're probably going to have some issues with this. So if you do have issues where stuff isn't merged, you can select everything, hit the A key, Alt-M, and then you can do by distance, and it's going to merge stuff around. But let's just delete this guy. You can also do sanity checking by enabling this as well, and you can see if there is something wrong with your model.
But again, remember to only use subdivisions as a way of checking your progress on your model. It shouldn't be used as a crutch for when you don't have enough detail. Another
tool which we can show you, which is awesome. This is the grid fill feature. So let's just add some detail up here. Now we are making it like some art. It's almost a bit artificial, just because we need to show you the tools. We're going to be more going into specifically organic cases where you can actually use this later on. But the grid fill is amazing. So let's just select some some loops here, or some polys. So you want to fill in this area here. This is something you have all the time when it comes to retopology. You want to fill in this area here, and everything is matching. You can just see it is a straight up grid. So what you can do, you can open up the search feature, which depending on how you set it up is probably either spacebar or it's the F3 key. In my case, it's spacebar. Type grid fill, and then hit enter. And now you can see it just by magic, it just fills it in.
Actual 3D magic.
Actual 3D magic. Now if we go under the settings here, you can see we have offset as well. Because sometimes it doesn't come in correctly. The math is still correct, that everything connects up properly, but it just isn't, it just doesn't align properly.
I've had this be a particular issue when you have circular objects like cups or spheres or something like that at the top of the poles. Sometimes it just can't guess which way you want it to face. So that's where the offset comes in really handy.
The thing is really annoying that Blender can't read your mind. I heard that comes in Blender 282.
That's an add-on.
Actual neural link add-on.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Another one which is really useful is proportional modeling, or just soft selection. You can enable that by going up here and proportional editing, and now we can click a single point, hit the G key, and then we can scroll up and down to change the fall off of it. This is really useful if you just want to move stuff around, like bigger chunks around, where you can just really change it. The cool thing is this snaps to the surface as well because of our shrink wrap modifier.
And this is a pretty common way to actually do tweaks to your topology, because you don't have to move one vert at a time.
Yeah, it becomes very painful if you have to move everything. So this is a really good way of doing it. Again, I can enable proportional editing up here, or the hotkey is O. Now this is a really cool trick as well we'll show you, which revolves around using the sculpting tools to relax your mesh. If we go into object mode, and then we go all the way to the top left, we can now enable sculpt mode. Now you have a lot of sculpt brushes, which we'll cover in a separate tutorial. We can now use the shift key to smooth it around. We can use left mouse button or the tablet, whatever you're using, to actually move it around here. Now, the problem with this, though, is that you can't actually see what you're doing that well. Here, it's pretty low res, but once it's more high res, you can't really see the topology. So we have to go into our viewport overlays and enable wireframe, and then we can start to smooth it around. Use the F key to make the brush bigger or smaller, and then we can just start to smooth it around.
The nice thing about having this being, a procedural system with modifiers is that now it's being shrink wrapped to your mesh live while you're smoothing it out, so you don't have to like shrink wrap it again or anything. That's one of the really powerful things about having modifiers in Blender.
Make sure to disable wireframe once you're done with this as well, because there's no reason to have it on. And then we switch this back to object mode. And now the tab key is now going to toggle correctly between edit mode and object mode. And those are really the tools you need in order to get started with retopology. It is very simple when you really look into it. So with all this said, let's just delete everything apart from this polygon. Control I, and then we can delete faces. And then we can start just do like a super quick demo. Now we will do a separate tutorial on this in the near future. We just want to show you how you can actually do this, because there has been a lot of information now, and you might be a bit overwhelmed.
You might think, oh god, these guys are just frauds. They don't know how to actually do retopology. No, but like, I think one of the issues traditionally has been, especially with a lot of this kind of stuff in Blender, is that there hasn't really been a lot of outside voices who have used tools in production. So we're kind of hoping, to bring some of that knowledge that we've gained through production experience, and then bring it to the Blender community, to be able to like help people and give you some more in-depth training of how to actually get ready for working in the industry, whether you're using Blender, Maya, or Max. It doesn't really matter to us.
Yeah, we're really excited to get you started with this.
Yeah. And I think, with all the excitement about 2.8, there's so many more people that are just flowing into the Blender community now. So that's why we're hoping, to enter the market at a good time so that we can help as many people as possible.
It's such an interesting tool as well. I'm really enjoying modeling in Blender. It can be a bit frustrating at times when you're new to it, but it's a really powerful tool. It's
been a really nice change for me, actually, because I started in 3D Studio Max, and in Max we had modifiers as well. Went to Maya, and been using that for most of my professional career. And now going back and using a software like Blender, which has modifiers again, I've always loved modifiers, and it was always so sad to me that I couldn't have them in Maya.
Yeah.
After leaving Max, but
exactly the same. It's such a cool system.
Yeah, yeah. I guess you had it in Moto. You know.
No. But I had a Max, and I used Max for years as well. You can see here when it comes to retoping, like this is all real time, and you can see just in like a minute or so, you can lay down some really cool loops. Whenever you're doing this, it's really important that you keep it very clean. Like for instance now, since this, I've been thinking about this has the same amount of spans. Now I can just go here and just hold on the F key, and it just boom, do this, and then we already fill this area in, and then we can just go in and add, just refine a little bit. If you want to add, this is something we actually just forgot to tell you in the first part now with the tools. If you want to add new topology around the eyes, for instance, you can easily do this. If you deselect everything, just click an empty area, and you control right mouse button somewhere now. Now you can just start to add down verts if you're in vert mode, or add down edges if you're in edge mode. So this is really cool, because now we already have an edge here. Now we can hit the extrude key, and we can just move it down now. So now we can just start to move this around so it fits around the eye. Again, do it properly, methodically, and don't move away from this until it's done. And once it is done, then you can just start to move it around, rotate it around, and there you go. You could also do what we did before as well. Just control right mouse button and just do that. Hit the F key to blend between these two, and now we can hit the double G just to like slide it between it.
Yeah, so there's no real magic behind retopology. It is slow, methodical work. It can be either therapeutic or boring, depending on who you are.
Yeah, and how long you've been doing it for.
Yeah, that as well. And also the complexity of the character that you're retopologizing, of course. But like the methodical workflow is just lay down the main loops. Don't get bogged down with too many details in the beginning. You might look at the brows here and the eyes and think, well, that's not nearly enough detail to support the face. And that's true. But, that comes later.
Yeah. Yeah, whenever I've been doing retopology for production, I'm always really liking the first few days, and then week 2 comes around.
Yeah, because like it's a puzzle in the beginning, and then once it turns into pure tweaking, you just want to end it. It's just
yeah, I know your feeling. So you can see here, I'm really just doing simple tools. I'm really just using very simple tools here, and F2. I know the actual key, just the add-on to do this kind of things.
Okay.
You never know with Blender.
Yeah, that's true.
So once you just get some of this into muscle memory, it becomes very quick to do this.
Blender's actually become a really nice sculpting software now. You can actually create some really cool things in there. Now this sculpt was made in Blender 2.8, so not highly advanced, not super detailed, but you're really able to control the forms quite nicely now. So the first thing you want to do is just select your object and then go into sculpting mode. So for those who haven't navigated in Blender before, just to keep in mind this is default Blender navigation that we're using. Middle mouse button is to rotate around. Then you hold shift and middle mouse button to pan around, control and middle mouse button to zoom in and out. You can also hit alt and middle mouse click on any point on your sculpt to center in on that point. So this can be quite helpful if you've dragged your mesh around and all of a sudden the sort of like camera pivot is offset somewhere. So Alt middle mouse click on your mesh.
I also just want to add that we are using a tablet here, and that we highly recommend that you use a tablet. There are a lot of questions whether you can sculpt with a mouse, and technically you can do that, but this is going to cause all sorts of issues for your hand and wrist and shoulder and everything. Plus your sculpts just aren't going to look that good.
So if you're just getting started, maybe see if you can get like a cheap Wacom Bamboo or something, you know, or a similar tablet, just to get started with sculpting and sculpting with a tablet. It's really going to take your sculpts to the next level. There's no like magic bullet when it comes to sculpting, but using a tablet over a mouse is pretty close. So the first thing we want to do is change this. The default matte cap, this is a matte cap in Blender, I don't think looks very nice, and it also gives you an inaccurate view of what your model actually looks like. So if you zoom further out, you can see this cavity matte that gets applied. It gets more and more intense. So if you just go out to your viewport shading, click the matte cap. I usually go with like a default white one here, and then just turn off cavity. So you can see it pronounces your details quite a lot and gives like a pretty inaccurate view of what your model actually looks like.
Almost doesn't look like the same model after you disable it.
So, you know, for some people you might want to turn on cavity and change this to world. It takes some of the cavity-ness away, but still enhances the detail. So this can be nice for maybe presenting your model, because it gives it a little bit of ambient occlusion kind of look to it. But for sculpting and for most things, I just turn it off. All right, so just to get started here, there are a few settings that we need to cover, and then we'll get into the brushes and how to actually sculpt. So here along the top here, we have sculpt mode. You can switch between object mode and sculpt mode really easily there. And then you can see this is a context-aware menu where view, sculpt, brush, and hide masks live. This is just like, this is a default thing in Blender, but perspective and orthographic you can do with a numpad 5. This can be super helpful when you're sculpting and you don't want to get distracted by perspective. It's really important that you remember to turn perspective back on again. The number of times when you've sculpted something and you don't have perspective on, your mesh just starts to look weird. The same thing with local view. That's just to isolate whatever mesh you have selected.
Yeah, if you sculpt your entire model with perspective off in ortho view, like it's not going to work. You're going to have to basically redo the entire thing.
And this here up here is a sort of quick select for your sculpt menu. You can see the only thing that's toggled up here is Symmetry X. Symmetry X is just, it lets you sculpt on 2 axes as one, so you just have to do half the work basically. So this is just a quick navigation menu to help you toggle that on and off. The brush, you have unified size as the default, which is checked. Unified size is actually quite nice because you see the red reticle here, that's the size of my brush. So I'm currently on the draw brush. And if I switch to something like the sculpt, the clay strips brush, you can see that the size remains the same. Now if I go to brush and I change on TIG unified, say I make this brush really big, go back to draw, you can see this brush is now a lot smaller. So I just recommend putting this, having this on by default, because it just makes it a lot easier to switch from brush to brush. That way you ensure that all your sculpting is like the same size basically. And then a few more hotkeys here for when we get into masking. It's just to get you familiar with, and you actually have a place that you can check these hotkeys, and it doesn't all live like under the hood somewhere. All right, so basic sculpting in here is pretty simple. Let's go back to our original brush. I'm just gonna drag this menu out so we can see it a little better and see what the names are. The draw brush is the default brush. And you can change the brush size with the F key and change, so now it's going to be a big brush. And then you can change the intensity with Shift F. So Shift F, you can see the closer you get to the center, it's 1 or like 100% intensity and 0 intensity. So, default is around half, and that just gives you a nice look. Like some brushes you want to keep them at 1 to really push the detail level. You don't want this for all brushes. Most brushes, I would recommend keeping it around maybe something like 0.5. And in order to actually sculpt, you just hit the left mouse button if you're using a mouse, but with a tablet, you just press on the tablet and then you just start sculpting. A really cool feature when it comes to sculpting, this is pretty standard in all sculpting tools now, is you hold down Control and that subtracts your sculpting. So you can go quickly between adding form and subtracting form. So This is pretty handy when you're sculpting because you don't always want to add form. You oftentimes want to vary between the two.
Yeah, get used to this and just try it out a lot when you're in the beginning, because you're going to be going between adding and subtracting constantly.
Yeah. And then with all brushes selected, actually, an option that you have is that you can hold down Shift, and that lets you smooth out your detail level. So sometimes you want to get rid of some of the details that you've done to create new details. So holding down Shift just allows you to do that.
Again, one of the brushes you're going to be using probably all the time in the beginning.
Yeah, exactly. So in order to make sculpting a little bit nicer, there are a lot of settings within Blender that you can, tick on and off. I recommend leaving most to default, but I just want to go over a few of them here and just to give you an overview of what it is. So under the brush settings, next to your brushes here, you have this option which is called Accumulate. So by default, maybe this is better to show with the clay strips. If you just keep sculpting, eventually your brush is going to get to a point where it doesn't want to add more detail. So with Accumulate on, it just keeps building and building and building on that detail. Let me show you. If I just turn it off, it hits a peak, and then it just doesn't want to add more detail here. For me, it's totally personal preference. I feel I have more control over form and can quickly add form if Accumulate is turned on.
Yeah, I always keep this on as well. I used to keep it off. Now this was in ZBrush some years ago, but exactly the same concept. I used to sculpt with it off, but again, my personal preference just changed. So whatever you want to do here.
Yeah. And these items here in the top menu can be found over here as well. And as well as here. So there's a lot of different ways to access these settings. The next one is going to be front faces only. This should be on by default. Front faces only basically means that it'll only sculpt on whatever you can see in the view. So if I have a really large brush, you see it makes this weird artifact looking thing.
Beautiful.
But it's actually intentional. It means that it leaves this stuff alone. Whereas if I turn it off and I start sculpting again, now you can see, okay, there's no artifact, but it actually starts to move out whatever's behind the mesh. So maybe for most of the time when you're sculpting like on a spot like this, you don't want that weird artifacting, so you can turn it off. But whenever you're doing surfaces that are really close together, like maybe you're sculpting ears, for example, the flesh in the ear be the same in the mesh. It's going to be really close together. So with a really big brush size, it can be really easy to go through the mesh. That's where front faces only is going to be really, really helpful. Next up, we have the smooth stroke, which we find over here in stroke. So smooth stroke just allows you to make really, smooth strokes. So by default, if I just make a stroke here, I just go around and it's super responsive, one-to-one with my cursor. Shift S, or just hit the enable, Shift S to enable, unenable. Then you can see we get this like little stroke behind it, and that's like a delay. You see the brush doesn't actually start to do anything until we've hit the threshold, which is the radius of 75 pixels. So if you want an even smoother stroke, you can turn this up to, something crazy. You can see we get a really smooth stroke. So this is really helpful, especially if you're sculpting detail. Maybe you have like this cool Renaissance style dress or something that has really Baroque details, or like you're sculpting, an opera or something. That stroke here can be really helpful for that because it just makes it completely smooth. I
also find this to be really useful if you're doing more stylized characters where you really have to control your curves. If you're doing something very, very realistic in terms of character, you might not want it on, but particularly for like where you really need to control your curves, this is essential.
Yeah. Other things in the stroke menu are, if you look at this, the clay strips one, you can see we get this faceting or the stepping in the stroke. This can be really cool for your initial concept where you want it to look very sculptural. But if you want to do something more polished and you want to get rid of that, you can change the spacing. Right now it's set to 10%. Set it to something lower. Right now it's 1. It can slow down your brush as well if you set it too low, but it just gives you a much, much smoother stroke.
Yeah, this is how I prefer to work. I prefer to remove brush strokes as early as I can, really, and just develop the form. But again, personal preference.
Now, another thing in here is the stroke method, which I'll show you in conjunction with the fall off method. So fall off is, if you change the brush size, you can see right now it's black in the center and then it just fades out completely linearly to the edges where it's completely transparent now. So that's just a completely linear fall off from center to the outside. So if we change the fall off here in just the draw brush, for example, I found this really cool example. If I do this like that, now you can see that the fall off has changed. Now there's a lot more detail on the outside and there's no detail on the inside. So if I were to just start dragging stuff out here, it's gonna look a lot weirder now. But you can play around with this fall off in conjunction with something like the stroke. Let's say you set it to drag dot. Drag dot just drags out one instance of your brush stroke, and then you can make a, what do we call it, like a Cheerios alien or something.
Yeah, like a Cheetos alien.
So definitely experiment with that, or you can just set it back to the default one here. So there's a lot of really cool things that you can do with that. Most of it I would leave to default, but remember the accumulate setting, and also smooth strokes is also, it's definitely going to be your friend. Now the next thing, which is really important when you're working with sculpting inside of Blender, is going to be the Dyne Topo. Dyne Topo is a way to create more resolution for your mesh. Now this mesh here wasn't just created like this, that's multiple revisions of more and more resolution being added on top. We can see this if we turn on the wireframe. You can see it's a pretty dense mesh. So we just added more and more detail constantly. Actually leave the wireframe on so this is easier to show. So what is Dyne Topo? Well, Dyne Topo basically lets you subdivide your mesh, but selectively. So if you worked with 3D before, especially in Blender here, you can add the subdivision modifier to subdivide your entire mesh to get more detail. Dyne Topo is kind of like that, but localized. So if we turn it on, also the hotkey is Control D if you want to turn that on. Now, let's see. Right now I have it set to constant detail. If we set it back, relative detail should be default. And then once we start sculpting, whoops, let's just set it back to, I think we still have drag dot enabled. Set it back to space. And now once we start sculpting, you can see based on what our detail size is, it's going to give us a different detail level. Now relative detail is relative to your cursor size compared to the mesh. So if you zoom in more, you're going to get more detail. If you zoom out, you're going to get less detail. So it's a pretty simple concept actually. Probably the most useful is going to be constant detail, where you get to pick a resolution, let's say 20 or something, and then it's always going to be 20. No matter what your brush size is, no matter how far away you are from the mesh, it's always going to stay at this value. So you have a lot more control, I think, with constant detail, but it's really personal preference. The last one I want to cover is brush detail, which is like a combination of the two. So it takes your brush size into consideration, which is based on it's a screen-based cursor. So the further you are in on the mesh, the more it's going to change. And also once you start changing your brush size, the smaller it is, the more detail you're going to add. You have to be a little careful with this. You don't want to make your brush too small and start adding too many details, because it can severely slow down your sculpting if you add too many details at once.
It might also look really weird as well if you have really like triangulated areas with extremely high areas of density as well.
Yeah.
You might want to like have some hierarchies here where the back of the head is really low res, and then it gets denser and denser as you get closer to the eyes, for instance.
And now just to give you a quick overview, I don't want to go through all the brushes because I don't think all of them are very good. This is the case with all sculpting, no matter which software you're sculpting in. Most of the time, people always ask like, "Oh, so what's the magic brush? What's the brush that you're using for specifically
There's always one.
this wrinkle that you made here? What was that brush?" And it's like the reality is maybe you use a handful of brushes. So draw. Let's just turn on Dyne Topo because we don't want to slow this down while we're drawing here or sculpting. The default draw brush is really good for adding volume. And if you combine that with maybe something like a lower intensity, Shift F to change that, you can add some really nice volume really quickly, and you can get this very fleshy feel. You go in some places with a smaller brush, hold down Control, smooth it out a little bit, and add some contrasting detail on the other side, and that way you can build up form really easily. So this brush is excellent, and it's a really good all-purpose brush. The next one I use most of the time is actually going to be clay strips. Like I don't really use clay that much because clay is very soft. For me, personally, I just like a harder stroke, I suppose. I can add more detail with this, and you combine this with the accumulate option. Find it there, up there. And with accumulate on, I can really build up volume really quickly. You know, you go across the form like this, maybe you add more intensity, something like this, you smooth it out a little bit, and then boom, you have a really nice jaw.
You can do nearly all your sculpting only with this brush.
Yeah, basically.
When I'm sculpting, I'm usually sitting with this brush for the majority of the form, and then I'm using the draw brush to add more specificity. Let's say I need like the line around the mouth or the eyelids and all these kind of things is really good for. They work really well together. It's not a competition. It's just what brush is good for.
Yeah, there's a brush for whatever you need. You know, it's not. There's definitely cases where one brush will perform better than another. So it's just figuring out what that is and getting comfortable with them. Another one is the inflate brush. So inflate is really nice if you want to add fat volume to your mesh. So in places like this, maybe you want the lids to be more baggy. You want to add some, like a feel of some gravity to it. You can come in with the inflate brush and just add that a little bit, maybe smooth it out just a tad. Inflate brush is really good for that.
I use inflate a lot when I've been adding wrinkles and pores and stuff to my models. If you want to really enhance them, inflate is fantastic for that.
Yeah. And then the crease brush is like, it's like a dual action brush that cuts into your mesh, and I think it also pinches it a little bit. So you can see it actually starts to create these really tight wrinkles. Again, you know, maybe this is something that you want to use around the eyes, or you want to use it for form buildup. You can use it for scars, something like that. And just vary the form a little bit, maybe around the lips. Maybe you have some really dry lips, you have a scar around the lip, you can do that. The really cool thing about this brush is that, so the default action is to cut in, which you've noticed is like the opposite of all the other brushes. If you hold down Control, then you can do the opposite of that and add some really hard edges next to what you've just cut in. And that way you create this almost shell-like hard surface, especially when you're sculpting maybe organic creatures. You can get a really cool feel. Something like that.
This technique is fantastic, in particular, like Morten was saying, if you're sculpting like crustaceans.
Yeah.
A few years ago, we worked on Pacific Rim 2, and there was a character which was a crustacean, and I was using this brush all the time to create that kind of shelling. Just hold down the Control key to really get these lovely creases. It sped up the work so much.
Yeah, it's pretty handy. And what you can do, if you feel you don't get enough pinching from this, is you can just go in with the with the actual pinch brush, and then just pinch it together a little bit. That just makes it a little bit tighter. So next one is going to be the scrape brush, and the scrape brush just flattens out the form a little bit. You go in here with the scrape brush, you can just flatten out the form. This can be really cool for making hard surface concepts. If you want to sculpt those, maybe you're doing something more organic, mech-like. You can come in here, not with too high intensity. I don't like to keep the intensity all the way at 1. But you do this, you can get some really nice and edgy edges. You do it on the opposing side as well, and you get this really hard edge as well. You can combine this with the crease brush when you hold down Control to emphasize this edge even more, and now you have a really hard edge here. You get a weird alien ear.
It's really nice to use these brushes, which gives you planes in the beginning phases of sculpting.
Yeah.
Because it's so easy with all these brushes that you get these incredibly washed out volumes. It just really looks like a potato, where there are no shapes for anything. But if you can just make these nice planes, then you can go over it afterwards and then smooth it out.
Yeah. The next one is going to be the grab brush. So the grab brush, you can grab a piece of your geometry and move it around. It's a very simple brush. That's all it does. You know, that's about it. But it might seem simple, but it's super powerful. Like, if you've already done something in your sculpt and you want to change the proportions of it, maybe this character needs to look more feeble, he's thinner, he's been in like a prison camp or something for 20 years, he's never been fed anything except for ash or something.
That's a terrible diet. Has no nutrition at all.
You know, you can use the grab brush to just really quickly move it in and out. And again, you can choose the intensity for this, whether you want more or less. Maybe the default intensity is pretty good. I don't know what it is, like 0.3 or something. So, but definitely play around with that.
The grab brush is, again, top 3 brushes. That is
100%.
If you had to remove everything from sculpting apart from 3 brushes, this one would have to be there.
then you have the snake hook. Snake hook might not seem like an essential brush, and it isn't. So that would be why.
We're done.
But it's really good for concepting. So let's say I was working on something like this. I'm like, oh, I want a different shape to the ear. You can just take the snake hook brush and you can drag out some shapes. Now you have to be careful with this because you are messing up the form. This is where you'll have to go in with the Dyn Topo and just remesh this again, because you see it actually does, it just stretches this quite a lot. But that sort of segues very nicely into the next brush, which is the Simplify brush. So with Simplify enabled, you have to also enable Dyn Topo. Simplify doesn't actually deform the surface. It's like if you set any brush to 0 intensity, they're basically the Simplify brush. So here, let's say we do constant detail of 25 or something. And you just go over this, and now you have a remeshed ear. So now we've created more topology. You can see here there's like 10 faces or something, and now we actually have topology we can work with. And if it's too low with the Simplify brush, you can just go back in and smooth over it. Now, one issue you run into when you go from low to high like this is that you can see your surface actually doesn't change. So if we go out of wireframe again, this is quite messy now. And that's where you can turn on auto smooth. Like, I wouldn't use auto smooth with any other brush, I think, but with the Simplify brush, it can actually work quite nicely, because as you start to simplify the surface, you can smooth it out as well. So it just allows you like this one action instead of first simplifying and then coming in with the smooth brush. So it's just a little optimization tip. So next up, we're going to look at how to clean up your geometry. Now, this probably doesn't happen that much, but maybe for some reason you're testing out something on only one side of your mesh. So you have symmetry enabled by default and symmetry on the x-axis. So if I just disable that now, that's what we talked about in the beginning of the video. Now you can see I actually only have sculpting detail on one side of the mesh. And this might be perfectly fine. This might be what you want. But maybe you did this by accident and you're like 20 hours into a sculpt.
That would suck.
That would suck a lot.
If only there was a button to fix this.
And there is.
What?
So the annoying thing is you can't, like, I don't usually like to work with Dyn Topo on because it slows down your sculpting a little bit. But let's say I did this, hit Control D to turn on Dyn Topo again, and now the remesh menu sort of like gets unlocked for us. So, really cool thing about the remesh menu, here you can see we can symmetrize the mesh. So right now he has a messed up brow, but on the other side he has a really nice brow. You just click symmetrize from -x to x, which is going to be this axis to this axis, and then it just mirrors it over. So you can do that on other axes as well. A crazy example would be the z-axis. So from minus to plus.
This is going to look awesome, folks.
So this way you can really experiment and do crazy concepts, I suppose, if that's what you wanted to do.
I've seen some very interesting concepts done this way, where it looks exactly what you would expect. But
so something like that. That's where this is really powerful. So it gives you the freedom to work on maybe one side. You don't want to be bothered with the other one. You just symmetrize it and pull it over. Now another cool option here is going to be the detail flood fill. This is dependent on your menu item. This only appears under constant detail, I think. So with this, I'm not going to do it because it's just going to take too long. But essentially you can see I have a lot of different levels of detail. Let's say I set this to around 20, 26. I think this was the detail level we painted here. Then I click this button, my entire mesh is going to get this detail level. So we're going to lose a lot of detail. So you might ask, why would I ever want that? Well, you probably don't want it if you go down in subdivisions, but if you want to add more detail to your mesh, you could crank this up and say detail flood fill. And that's just going to add more detail to your overall mesh. So it's quite a handy option. You just have to be a little careful with it. All right, so getting into the nitty gritty here, the next thing is going to be masking. Masking is an essential feature when you're doing any sort of sculpting. And you might ask, why would I ever need to mask anything? Can't do that in real life. But in 3D, if we enable the mask brush here, you can see we can start painting on top of the mesh. So we're basically, it's not like real paint, it's just like a temporary mask.
It's like putting masking tape on top of your thing. So
yeah.
If you were to, so it means you can't touch the area which has been masked now.
So now, if I just hit G for the grab brush, if I start to move this out, you can see I can't actually I can actually affect the masked area. So this can be quite nice if you want to do specific things around a mask, or if you want to add like some really hard detail like this. You can see now it's unaffected. This would take a long time to sculpt, and you would actually also ruin your detail here. But with the grab tool in conjunction with masking, you can like pull it out and change the form quite drastically.
Masking is really, again, top 5 features of sculpting. It might not seem like much, but you are going to be using this constantly.
And now the hotkeys for masking you can find up here, as we showed you before. So if you press Control I, you can invert the mask, and now you can, mess around with what you had masked before. You can also hit Control M, Alt M to clear the mask. It's just Alt anything in Blender, I suppose, at this point. You just Alt anything, It's the inverse action, which is really cool. But a really cool feature, this is how I usually work with it. I mask an area out that I want to work on. Then I hit Control I to invert it. Then I go up to Hide Mask and say Hide Masked. That way I can work purely on this area, and maybe if I wanted to work from it behind, maybe you had an ear that poked out so I couldn't actually see this area. It's a really nice way to just isolate an area really, really quickly.
What I would use this specifically for is, let's say you need to close the eyes, then you can mask the lower lid and move the upper lid down, and invert the mask and then move the lower lid up.
Yeah.
It's a really cool way of closing the eyes.
And then with Alt H, so H for hide, if you press the H key, you get the hiding up. Alt H just inverts that. Alt M again to undo the mask. So if you just move further down, underneath the mask feature, we have the mask box, which does the same thing, except now we can just drag it out. You can also hit the Control, Shift, and left mouse button, and then you have a lasso that you can just sort of like drag out. This is, I think, probably the most useful because it's a very organic way to just quickly mask an area out. And then in conjunction with the hide mask feature, this just becomes really, really powerful.
I would use the rectangle here for, let's say you want to cut away the head or mask the body. Now you can quickly just mask the neck out.
Yeah.
So you have a nice clean mask for that.
And then you can also go in, let's say with the box mask, and then hold down Control, and that sort of like takes away from this mask as well. If you want, maybe you have a really harsh selection here. You can go in with your mask brush and hold down Shift. It doesn't actually smooth the mesh, it will just smooth the mask. So maybe if you're looking for something specific, you want to do like a really soft gradient, you can come in afterwards and smooth out the mask, like a smoothing mask tool, basically. And then finally, we have the hiding box. So just showed you that a little bit before, but this is just a quick way to do it. You just select the tool and that hides everything that you hit. You can click in the viewport to unhide it. But if you're in any other tool, what you can do is you can just press the H key, and there we go. Now you can hide stuff, and then again Alt H to undo that, basically.
Very handy.
So the last thing is going to be like a bonus feature. It's if you're working on multiple objects. You can see here I'm actually only working on one, but he has 2 eyes as well. So let's say I wanted to work on the eyes as well. You can just go up to sculpt mode or hit Control Tab, go into object mode, select your eyes, Control Tab again, go to sculpt mode, and now we can actually move. Now we can actually move this around and sculpt on this. The one thing you have to keep in mind, especially if you have something like this, right now for me I have symmetry turned on. So once I start sculpting on this, it looks a little bit weird. So you can always go and turn off symmetry, and then you can sculpt on multiple objects like this.
Okay, let's cover UV mapping. Now, UV mapping is one of those slightly confusing topics, mostly because you have the question, well, what actually is it? You keep seeing people talking about UV mapping, you keep seeing like checkers applied to models and all that. And UV mapping is a really essential part of your asset workflow if you're using textures. Now, a UV map is simply a 2D representation of your actual model. So here we have UV mapped our character, and we have just flattened it down into 3D space. Now, you never really have to, don't have to flatten down into, actual 3D space like this. This is just a demonstration of what it actually looks like. So the reason we do this is because now we have a 2D version of our model, which means we can now paint textures for this. This is really the primary reason why you want to UV map. Now, there are some more advanced ones if you go heavy into production, but for all intents and purposes, the only reason we are going to UV map our character is so that we can paint textures on it. It means that now the painting software knows where all these points here are in 2D space, because when you're painting textures, you are painting in 2D space. You might be painting actually in 3D, but all the data is converted to 2D. So it's incredibly important that you have a 2D representation here. And this just has to be done by hand. There currently aren't any good solutions for doing this automatically. So it's incredibly important to actually understand how to do this. So we need to now switch the tab for the first time, switch to workspace. We can see up here we've been in layout up until now. Now we are going to go into more specialized workspace, which is called UV editing. UV editing just has a few more things set up, namely just the UV editor view here. If we just create a sphere right now, you can see that we have an option here for generate UVs. Generally, when you are creating geometry, it's a good idea to keep this on. Now, that said, for complex pieces, let's say you're doing a head, if you're doing retopology for that and you're starting from a cube, it really doesn't matter because you're going to be recreating this from scratch at all. What you should note here is that when we select generate UVs, under UV map here, you can see a UV map actually appears. If you don't have this here, let's say you were to you'd forget to create it, and then you don't have a UV map at all, you can easily create a UV map going over here. And let's say you were to screw the UV map up beyond reason, so everything is broken. We'll probably do this at some point throughout this chapter. We can just delete the UV map, and then we can just create a new one. This just resets everything for it. Now, we can bring up the UV map menu by hitting the U key. You've got to be in edit mode for this, and then you can select, for instance, some faces, and then we can hit the U key. And now you can see that we have different ways to UV map our character. This is, our primitive. Now you can see here that now whatever is selected, it's just created like a default. It's just created like a default UV map over here. Now whatever is here is just trash, and we aren't going to be using this. What we're going to be looking into is how can we get these faces here into the UV map view. Now, there are a few ways of doing this. If we just select everything, hit the A key, then we can select the U key. You can also right click, and then we have some options here as well for UV mapping as well, but it's just faster to hit the U key. So we have a few options here. We have unwrap, which we're going to get to in a little bit. Then we have live unwrap, which is related to unwrapping. We have smart UV project. Let's try to click that and see what happens. We get up this little dialog box, which just has some settings. These aren't really going to make sense just intuitively, so we're going to have to just click OK and see what happens. So this is what it's doing. It is now just creating seams in the viewport based on that. So now we have just very quickly just UV mapped our object, but this smart way of UV mapping, it is a little bit like making a deal with the devil, where now you have really fast UVs, but they're not necessarily very good to paint with. Now, they might be perfectly fine, but just be aware that you shouldn't just hit smart and just call it a day, particularly not for more complex objects, though it can be a fantastic way to get started. Hit the U key again. We also have cube projection, which is gonna simply take a cube around this model and just project it down onto it. This can be really handy if you just need to quickly get something out and just project some textures on it. Same with cylindrical projection. This is going to do essentially a cylindrical projection. Take a cylinder around this whole thing from here, down here, and just project it onto it. Then we have sphere projection, which is doing the same thing. It just takes a sphere and just projects it onto it. You can also see for all these, we also have options for them as well. Now, I don't tend to use the spherical ones a whole lot, but it's still quite handy to know. We also have an option here as well, which is project from view. This can be quite useful. Now you can see that whatever we have in the view is exactly what will be projected here. So let's say you have a matte painting or some sort, you're doing an environment and you have a piece of geometry like this and you just want to paint on this exactly from the camera. We can now just select everything, hit the U key and then project from view. And you can now just simply in a software, you can just start to paint onto this and that's going to project perfectly onto here. Really, really handy stuff. Now we have only shown you automatic ways so far of doing it. This doesn't allow you to really have any control. So we need to show you how to really control the UV mapping. The UV mapping is controlled generally by selecting either polys or edges, and then we mark them as seams, and then we can project from there. Basically, we are cutting things out of this piece and we're projecting it. If we go back to our example here before, we're looking at this. It's kind of like you are, this sounds like a macabre way of, this is like a macabre way of putting it, but it's kind of like you're making like a human mask from this. It's kind of like you're making a flat version of it from like you turn this guy into like a carpet basically, and you got to figure out where the seams are. So the way we figure out where the seams are, that's just based on how this is unfold. So that's at least the way it works for me. You know, it's like if you have a deer and you need to turn that deer into like a carpet, you know, you have to have seams somewhere. So actually like a deer carpet is very similar to what a UV map is going to look like, because it's doing the exact same thing. It's turning a 3D object into a 2D object so that you can either paint textures or you can sit in front of it, in front of a fireplace. So let's go back to our sphere. Now, if we want to get specific faces in here, now what we have to do, we can just select this. We can just grow our selection. We can hit the U key, and now you can see we can just hit unwrap. And this just brings this piece in here. Now, you are noticing quickly, and this might be a source of great frustration, that the moment you click away from the piece, you can no longer see it. Now, and then you start to select stuff again, and you can now see that, oh, awesome, now it's back in the UV view. So there are two ways to really fix this. One is to just make sure everything is selected whenever we're moving stuff around here. If you want to move this up and down, using the move tool. Or you can select this button up here called Sync UV Selection. This can also be quite useful, but it has some problems as well, which we are going to be looking into in a little bit. We can also select different pieces here by going under just selecting some edges like this. And now we can mark these edges as seams. This has an advantage as well. Instead of simply selecting all the polygons and then unwrapping them, we can now just select edge loops, for instance, or we can do it like this. So hit the U key, and now we can do mark seam. And now you can see this is marked with red here in the viewport. Now, why didn't we just do this again and select this? You totally could have. That's going to have the same result. The difference is that now, for instance, we can select an edge loop like this, hit the U key, mark seam, and we just very quickly selected it instead of going up here and selecting like this. So you want to probably do a combination of selecting seams, selecting edges for seams, or just selecting polygons. Ultimately though, what matters is can we bring this into this space. Now we can select everything here, and then we can hit the U key in the UV view, and the U key will just do an unwrap. This is exactly the same as hitting U here and then doing unwrap. So now you can see what happens. We also have a really cool way of doing this live, which is hit the U key and now enable live unwrap. So if we were now to select more seams here, we can easily do this. We also have a little trick for you for quickly selecting seams. This is an option we've already enabled, and let's just show what this does. If you control click, that's just going to select. It's simply going to select the edges, like we've shown you before with pick shortest path. But now we have a little option here called edge tag. And now every single edge is going to be tagged as a seam. So by default, if we just set this to select, this is going to select the edges. This is super cool, and it allows you to do quick edge selection. But if you want to speed this process up, we can just set this here to tag seam. And now everything we were to select now, like this is going to be selected as a seam. And you can see here now, the cool thing is that this has now been unwrapped in real time. So this is really, really quick. when it comes to determining where your seams should be. For instance, should you have a seam up here? Well, let's see. You can select this one now. And now, instead of doing the tag, instead of using the shortest path tool, then you have to do this. And then that's like 3 clicks. We could do, instead, is just alt-click on it, select the seam, and then we hit the U, and then we mark the seam. Now you can see, just cut it off. A little tip here as well is that we can add either hotkeys, or we can just set this to quick favorites for mark seam. Now, if we click U for mark seam, we can right-click on it, and we can hit add to favorites. And now you can see here as well, if we were to select these two, and then we can hit mark seam, and there we go. Another one which is quite handy as well, you're going to be using this a lot, is if we hit the U key, we also have clear seam. This does the opposite of mark seam. This just welds the seams together. You can also map this to the hotkey as well, or sorry, the quick menu. Hit the U key, and then we can right click and hit clear, add to quick favorites. And now you can see if we hit the Q key, we have mark and clear seam. Like, this is where I probably wouldn't add this to hotkeys if you don't do this a lot. Like, if you, let's say you do this like every second week or something like that, every month, you don't have to add hotkeys to this, because that's just a big hassle, because now you have to remember all these hotkeys and you're gonna forget it. But it's really handy to just have like a little bucket of handy tools to use. So again, we can go to the bottom here, select this, hit the Q key, and now we can just hit mark seam, and this is now unwrapping in real time. We also have 2 different options as well when it comes to unfolding. If we hit the U key, we have 2 options here. We have method, and here we have angle based and conformal. Now these will just give you different results based on what it is. You should experiment a little bit with this. The only thing it's doing, it's not actually changing your cuts or anything. It's simply just giving you a different unfolding method. Some people prefer angle based for hard surface and conformal for organic. I've had a bit mixed results with that, but just try it out and see what fits your needs. We can also look into another handy thing, which is assigning a texture to this, so that we can see like a checker on it. Because right now we're just seeing here what's going on. We don't really have any actual idea of how this affects any stretching or anything like this. So we can easily do this. Now we are jumping a little bit ahead of ourselves here, because we haven't actually talked about how to assign shaders yet. We'll just quickly go over this now, and then we'll talk way more in depth about this later on. The way we do this is if we select our object first. Now here we have this nice little shader ball. You see it has checkers on it. If we go click on it, now you can see we can select a new shader. You have like one button here. So we just hit new. Now under color, we just want to insert like a quick checker onto this. If we go, just click this little friendly circle button, and now we can just select checker. Now nothing is happening right now, and this is because you can't really see your textures in the shaded view. We have to change this to a looked at view or rendered view. You access this menu by hitting the Z key. So just hit Z, or you can go up here as well and just click this as well. I recommend you use the looked at view for this. Now, right now this looks fine, because now we have a pretty evenly squared checkers on it. But the problem is right now this is just procedurally putting it on top. This isn't actually using the UV map for it. So if you want to do this, we can just quickly go to the vector setting, and here we can just set the target to be UV. And now you can see what's going on here. Now you can see that we just have that this actually corresponds to it. But the problem is right now it's incredibly big. You can't actually see what's going on. So we can just set this to scale to something higher. This becomes really important later on when we are actually doing a proper UV map for a character, where you have to make sure that these are all the same size, because right now they're not the same size, which becomes problematic when we're texturing. Now, this is not a texturing tutorial. We have a whole separate course in Substance Painter for that, if you're interested in this, where we cover UV mapping, or the theory of UV mapping more in depth. But right now, just know that you really have to have the same spacing or same checker size for this. So how do we do this? Well, we can do this by hand, where we can select a piece here. We can select this piece here, and we can scale it up and down. We can do this by hitting the L key, and we gotta select the tag to be, or limit to be seam. By default, it's gonna be regular, and it's gonna select everything. And that's awesome. That's what we've been using beforehand. Like, remember the monkey scene where we just selected the monkey's eye? That's really awesome for this. But now we can make it even sharper by clicking seam, or we can click UV. So now if we just click either one of them, you can see that now it's only gonna select this island up here. So let's try to scale this up and see what happens. And you're seeing that, cool, it's scaling this piece up, but it's also scaling these pieces here up. That's really annoying, and that's a limitation with the sync UV or the sync view feature. So how do we solve this? Well, the way I prefer to do this is I prefer to select everything, disable the sync UV feature, and now we can select it in here. We can just hit the L key to hover over it in the UV view, because now we don't have anything else selected on it. And now we can just scale this up and down so it fits this. We can also merge these together as well. Let's say we want to merge two edges or two edges together. We can do this. Just select sync UV view, so it's a bit easier to see. Let's say we want to merge this together with this, because we now want to just put it together. We can do, let's just select these two. Now this is we want to move these two together. We want to weld them together. Now if we go to the UV view up here, we can simply hit stitch, or we can hit the V key, and that's going to stitch it together. And then we can hit spacebar, and then we can hit left mouse button, and that's going to put it together. Very, very useful. So we can hit the V key, and then we can just hit left mouse button. Very nice and easy for stitching stuff together like this. Okay, so let's look into a more real example instead of doing this on a sphere, which isn't exactly helpful. Let's look into the head here. So the first thing we're going to be doing is we are going to be assigning a UV checker to this. Same thing we did before. So we just go under the material tab, hit new, and then we go to color, and then we hit checker texture, and make sure again to set the vector to be UV, because otherwise it's not going to work. And then we just scale this up a few times. Let's just try it out, something like this. We need to actually UV map to get feedback what scale this should be at. You can see though, like the only thing that's happening is like a single polygon here, because we haven't UV mapped this. If you've gone crazy and again screwed everything up, you can just hit the minus key, and then we can hit the plus key to get another one. So now we can, now we're going to show you some more advanced techniques here. We are only going to UV map half the character, because doing multiple seams or doing multiple sides is a complete waste of time. So now we set up the checker, at least temporarily. We are going to go into shaded mode again, because we don't have to see the textures. We'll get back to that. Go into solid view. And now we can start to select where the seams are going to be. And this is where you just got to think about where would the seams be if you were to cut this up and make a carpet out of it. This is, yeah, sounds messed up, but that's the way it helps at least me to visualize UVs. So what we can do now is we can just select the seams here on the bottom. So it goes around here, and we can just tag them as just control click on it. Now we can just tag the seams and make sure we have selected everything to the center. And we had some up here which we didn't select. So we can hit Q and then mark seam, and there we go. You can see it's now doing live unwrapping. We can disable this. We don't need this right now, because right now we are just selecting the seams. We want to cut the ears away as well, so we can easily do this by clicking here, around here. Whenever I'm modeling, I'm trying to have a nice clean loop around the ears as well. Just a little tip for you. So now if we just were to click it with the L, or hover over it and hit the L key, you can see the ear has now been split off. But it's still not good enough, because if we were to try to unfold this now, hit the U key, you can see that it's just going a bit crazy. We have all this crazy overlapping here, and you can't really fix this. The way we got to do this is we need to just split the ear in half. So we can do this just by finding like a midline seam like this, and then we just start to cut it in half. Control Shift click to Control click or Control Shift click, doesn't really matter when it comes to this. And we can just tag the seams. I prefer to just do this in like a few cuts, because it's really hard once you have more complicated geometry. Should you place it there or there, and then now you get these nasty cuts. So I prefer just to do this like more incrementally. It's a bit slower than just doing like a huge loop around it, but I find it to be faster overall. Okay, cool. So now we have the inside and the outside split out. So let's just see what this looks like. Now we can just select this, and now you can see that if we were to hit the U key now, this is going to unfold perfectly fine. I'm going to set this back to angle based. I find I have better results with that. Okay, so now if we were to go into the looked at view, you you can see that now we can see the actual size of the textures here. Now we can actually see what's going on. So the goal here is to just select everything we need, and then we are going to unfold it. You don't have to keep unfolding as you go along. That's just to show you what's going on. Okay, so we also want some seams which goes like here. We want to just cut the forehead off like so, and just cut it into the center. The seams are going to be symmetrical afterwards, so that's fine. Okay, we can also, this is a bit messy. We could also, just to show you how to clean this up, we can select these three, and then we can hit the Q key, and then we can do clear seam, and then we can select these two, and then we can hit mark seam. So now we just have a slightly cleaner selection here. So we have this piece is one. So now if we want to select the seam symmetrically on the other side, like we said before, there's absolutely no reason to select both sides like this, because then you're going to end up with a map which is not symmetrical at all, because you would inevitably mess up a seam where you might select something up here instead of selecting something down here. So we can easily do this by, if we were to select a simple seam here, and then we hit Shift G. So Shift G is awesome. We can use this for a bunch of different things, like select every bevel, all face angles, whatever it might be. We're going to be using the seam here. So hit the seam, and that's going to select all the seams in the entire seam. Now we can mirror this selection over by hitting spacebar and then selecting or searching for select mirror, and that's going to mirror the selection. We can also hit the hotkey Control Shift M if you do this a lot. I find myself not doing this all the time, so it's not necessarily selected or not needed. So now it's selected the seams on the other side. Simply hit the Q key and then mark seams, and then we should be good to go. Now, we still haven't tested if this works properly. So, you know, we might have to do more selection cuts here. That's generally the approach for UV mapping. And instead of showing you like exactly where the seams are, like pre-planning this out, we want to show you more of the actual organic process of it. Select everything now. Then we tap the U key, and now you can see what's going on. Now you can just see we get this nicely unfolded patterns here. And now if we were to hit the Z key again, and then go into look to view, you can see what's going on. We have this nicely spaced out checkers. We can also go in here again and just change the scale to something a bit higher, just so we can make sure there's no stretching here. So examples of where this would be bad, right now it's just good here. So you're not necessarily seeing any problems. I'm just going to quickly set this to smooth shade so it's a bit easier to see. Now this is just a really nice and clean UV map, but if you want to have an example of a bad one, let's select everything. Maybe something if we select this and then we just move it over here. You're going to see issues like this, or you might see issues where you scale this up a little bit and just scale it. You're going to see stuff like this, where it's just crazy difference in this. We can also still just select everything here, hit the U key, and then we can try out a different approach as well, just seeing if we get something better. Again, some people report that they have better results with conformal, and some have better results on angle-based. I generally find angle-based is a lot better, particularly if you were to look at the mouth here. Now, the problems here are probably just due to the modeling. If you were to look at here with conformal on, you can see that it's actually broken. Like, you would have to go in and fix this because it's overlapping. So conformal, also angle-based, stick to that. We can also change the margin. This is how much distance there is between the different UV islands as well. A little tip as well is that if we were to go under View, Display, we now have an option here called Stretching. This is going to give you an indication of how much stretching there is in the different areas. This is important because you might have areas which are crazy stretched. If we were to do this, you can just see that it lights up like a firefly here. It's just crazy. In general though, this level of stretching is perfectly acceptable because you are taking a 3D shape into a 2D shape, which just makes it really hard. Also keep in mind as well, just a quick little tip, if your selection here didn't work properly, then like the mirroring didn't work properly, you just have to symmetrize your model. Just make sure your model is perfectly symmetrical. I highly recommend that before you start UV mapping, that you were to add a mirror modifier and then just apply this mirror modifier onto it. You don't want to unfold this with this live, so make sure you just hit apply beforehand. Cool. So now we have a nice little UV map here. Now, if we want to just organize this a bit better, because we want to make this a bit more readable, we can now click this guy up here. This is selection, UV selection mode. Instead of L clicking on it, we can just simply click on it here. Now we can use the rotate tool. Hold down a control key to snap to increments. And now we can just move this around. I prefer to make a layout which is nice and readable for me as a human, and not just nice and readable for a computer. So I'm just selecting these things up here so that I can just see where these live in the viewport, because it's a bit hard to actually see what's what. Select this here, and now I know that this is the left ear, or his right screen left. Now we can start to rotate this around like so. Doing this takes a bit more time, but it's really handy because you're just going to have a way easier time texturing. And just the same modeling tools as you're already used to, or same, like you just click on it, hit the R key to rotate, and then you just hit the G key to move it around. Just maximize UV space a little bit like this. Move this up a little bit. I kind of like doing UV mapping because it feels like a puzzle. It is really like you got to figure out how the pieces fit together. We also have a really cool tool up here, which is the UV sculpting tool. So here we can select a piece here and we can just move it around. So this is a really cool tool because now we can just start to move stuff around like this. And if we hold down the shift key, we can start to smooth stuff around. We also have the same thing here for relax, which is basically just the shift key. So really useful stuff. If you have areas which are going a bit crazy, you can easily go over here and just fix this with the UV smoothing tool. So the very last thing we're going to be showing you is a more advanced tip. So right now we have just a checker to display the actual the texel density here, just how big the squares are. But what if you want to use your own image? A lot of times when I'm UV mapping, I really prefer to use my own image and not just a checker. The checker here is fine for just the scale, but it doesn't actually show you direction. So what you can do is, now this becomes a bit more advanced. So if you don't want to do this, that's fine. But if you're a slightly more advanced 3D user and you want to use your own image, this is really going to be helpful for you. Now we're going to have to go into the shading view. And here you can see what's happened when we added the little checker here. We are going to delete this, select the shader. Now, if you're unsure how this works, we have a chapter on this a little bit ahead. If we hit the Control T key, this brings up a lot of cool stuff. This brings up a lot like texture coordinates, mapping, and image texture, which allows us to quickly tile an image across and select this image as well. Now, keep in mind, this hotkey, Control T, only works if you have the node wrangler enabled. So we did that in one of the previous chapters, but if you don't have this, make sure that the node wrangler is enabled. Otherwise, you're going to have to set this up by hand, which is quite painful. This is very easy though, to just assign a texture. We just go to open, and then we find where our texture would be. Now these maps you can easily find simply by Googling UV checker or UV map texture. And now we have it assigned here. And you can see the difference is that this has numbers, which shows us the direction of the map. We'll show you a little bit in a while. We'll just show you quickly. We'll show you very soon what this actually, the purpose of this is. So now we can see here we have scale. So if we were to now select all of these, and now we can just drag this up and down. I prefer to use something like 6 or 7 whenever I'm UV mapping. This just gives me like a really nice indication of the actual scale. If this is set to something super low like 1 or 0.5, it's really hard to actually see what's going on. Okay, so now we have set up a custom map. And why is this important? Well, this is important when we select this. A lot of times you don't really know which way is up. Clearly, in a character like this, you know which way is up. That's not very hard to tell. But if you're doing something more complex, maybe you're doing the piece of armor or something, you don't really know. So if it's set like this, with just the regular checkers, you can't see that this is upside down. Because again, you can't see it based on this in the viewport because it doesn't look like anything here. So right now, you can easily tell that it's upside down. So that just makes your life a lot easier. And there are a bunch of reasons why you want to make sure the stuff isn't upside down. We aren't covering that here. This last part is just if you are a bit more advanced user and you're looking into how to set up this UV checker. So yeah, that's it for UV mapping in Blender.